All right, everyone, we should be live again. So this is the actual stream with the actual man himself, Doomer Media. The previous stream attempt, totally my bad. I wrote Doomer a message over my lunch break, and it was in a hurry. And I hadn't remembered that I now live actually on the eastern side of the United States, not the western side. And in my fingers, by force of habit, wrote PST as opposed to EST. And so I totally got the time wrong. Totally my fault. But if everything is working as planned and I haven't had yet another boomer moment, then we should be live and I should be here with Doomer Media. Was it Doomer Politics or Doomer Media these days?
It was Doomer Politics, but I'd rather not make content about politics, so I rebranded.
Well, I hate to say it. I was kind of hoping we would talk about politics on this stream.
Yeah. Well, I haven't made much content recently. The current plan is to make YouTube videos about media, like films and stuff, and then I'm going to stream at some point, and streams will probably be more focused around politics. So I just can't really avoid it. It's what everybody wants me to talk about. So,
well,
I'm a reluctant participant. Yeah.
This is just the age we live in. Everything has been politicized. This is a tragedy. I feel people on the right feel like they talk about politics because they have to talk about politics. It's not the framework we would like to approach everything in. That being said, so it sounds like you're planning to make content on things like movies and books and stuff like that.
Yeah. So I was a screenwriter. Well, I guess I still technically am, but I haven't been active for a while. But I've spent a lot of time analyzing films, and I'm not super happy about the existing film critique content on YouTube. There's only really a couple creators that I like, even though there's a lot of people who do it. Basically right now I'm working on, there's sort of several different components to making a film critique video. Right now I am very bad at the production side of it. So editing and audio editing, and everything that would go into that. I'm trying to become much, much better at that. I think I have a lot more to offer in terms of the actual analysis, but yeah, that's what I'm working on in terms of YouTube.
So that's interesting, and this allows me to kind of kick it off in a more laid-back fashion. I'm wondering, this is something I don't know. I watch a lot of left-wing content for a right-wing YouTube creator, and I definitely I don't think you made a ton of videos, but I definitely appreciate the ones you've made. And I think you describe yourself as a man from the left or from the general left-wing sphere.
I would describe myself as an anti-Ed Pol Sockdem. So economically, I'm pretty left-wing. Okay,
so I mean, fair enough. In my right-wing world, that's left-wing. But there's sort of, the last week, or actually just a few days ago, I was speaking to an old, this is really going to date me, but he used to be sort of in the MGTOW sphere, way back in 2015, 2014, when the whole manosphere, MGTOW stuff was big. He was considered to be in that sphere. This is a YouTuber called Stardust or Thinking Ape, and now he just makes more general content. But he and I, the first one we talked about was just a feeling of general cultural decline, not in sort of the ways that social conservatives care about, but just in terms of quality of media. Do you find that movies are a lot worse these days?
Okay, so there's sort of two things to say here. One is that I strongly dislike the idea of overly emphasizing old things. So in film, if you talk to people who are film savvy, let's say, there's an inordinate emphasis on movies that I think are made in the 40s and 50s, as though they're incredible. And I think a lot of it really does just come down to them being old. I mean, you could say that in a more sophisticated way, right? It's well, they're influential, but I mean, they're old. And it's a bit ridiculous, right? I try not to do that. That being said, the films that have been made in the last 10 years, I haven't met a single person who doesn't think there's a decline.
So this is not just a right-wing impression. This is a general impression.
No, I mean, in film, I think it's everywhere. But even in other art forms, like, I mean, in music, for example, you go back, look at the 70s, and there's like 5 to 10 different bands where I don't know that there's a single group today that would compare to any of them. I mean, in movies, it's very, very, very clear. Music, I know less about music. I'm not really qualified to talk about music. I
Well, I
don't
think
see anyone today that
rock and
compares
roll
to.
has become, the rock and roll's taken a steady decline.
Yeah, I mean, it's
That
not
in
just rock and
particular,
roll
like,
either. I mean, like, I really like hip hop. I don't see any current hip hop artists that compare to Tupac, and he was, I mean, relatively speaking, one of the first people to do it. But
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean,
Well, there's a whole like 80s and 90s. That was the Promethean generation of hip hop. That's when all of the greats were around. And I'm not that. I actually, for a right winger, I do respect hip hop because I love poetry, and hip hop is basically just lyrical poetry.
yeah,
But it's not really my style of lyrical poetry. I'll say that, but I respect it for what it is. And I think there's been a decline. Right, the last artist in that genre I remember is, what was it? Not
uh,
Jay-Z.
Kendrick Lamar is currently active, and he's very good. A lot of
Yeah,
people would say he's as good as Tupac, but aside from him, I don't know anyone else. I mean, people would say Kanye. Uh,
yeah, that's the one
I
I was
don't
thinking.
agree. Yeah. Some people would say Kanye. I mean, to be honest, I know very little about music compared to what I know about film. But
Mm.
my impression is that uh, you know, Kanye doesn't compare to Tupac, right? And I don't see any rock groups that get even close to Pink Floyd or Zeppelin or something like that. And you could say that those groups are overrated, and I would agree that in some sense they are overrated, but there's just still kind of dumpster anything that exists. And then when you look at films, so I used to be really serious about going out and watching as many films as I could and making lists of stuff, right? So I would have
Mm.
lists of films by year. Um, and you could go look at my lists for years in the 70s and even the 80s, which was considered an off decade for film. But especially if you look at the 70s or the 90s, you'd have individual years where I'd have 15 to 20 movies that I could recommend to somebody. Um, in the last 5 years, I mean, I would struggle to come up with a top five. I mean, it legitimately would struggle to come up with 5 movies I could recommend to people.
Yeah,
It's
it
really
would.
just quite sad.
That's hard. I mean, it's tempting to kind of come up with a story of what's happened, but for me, it feels like this has been general. This has been sort of all cultural forms.
Yeah,
I think it happened earlier for books, actually, right? I mean, the last author that was sort of universally appreciated as an author was David Foster Wallace, as
yeah,
far as I know. Like, and then it's kind of dropped off from there, and you heard about sort of these genre authors like YA, young adult literature, but you don't hear about these figures that are really going to reform the art and bring in some new perspective.
yeah. And when did David Foster Wallace stop? It was like early 2000s, late 90s, right?
Yeah, he killed himself in what, 2009, I think.
I don't remember exactly. I just sort
Yeah,
of have a
it
vague
was.
recollection of when it was.
Yeah, because that's when The Pale King came out, which is the book he kind of got halfway through writing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting. For me, this indicates some kind of transition in our culture, and that's how I think most people read it. And kind of the topic that I kind of want to talk to you about is, it seems like something similar is going on in politics as well, where I don't think that the regular political formulas make sense anymore. When you look at something like
Um,
the trucker revolt in Canada, or
well,
really
there's certainly,
anything.
yeah.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
mean, there's an element of that, yeah, for sure. I mean, like the trucker revolt's a worker revolt that the left hates. So, I mean, I can definitely see where you're going with that.
It also kind of feels that I don't know. I mean, it seems like I mean, maybe you can get. It seems also the left kind of backed into a corner ideologically. It
Um, God, I mean, I personally, I don't super like the term the left. Um, Partially because there's a lot of people on the left that I fucking hate, and I don't like being the same group as them. But beyond that, I mean, there really is. I mean, it's difficult to say that there is like a left. Like I don't have very much in common with like a soccer mom Democrat. and I also don't have very much in common with the communists. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, it seems like, if anything, hypothetically, the left should be ascendant right now, because they just, from my point of view, it just seems like they dominate most institutions, and the right's kind of institutionally cornered. But the left doesn't feel that way. It feels kind of like they're in this ghetto of the same ideas, and they're sort of circling them.
Oh yeah. Well, there's a sense there for sure. You mean like the cathedral, basically, like the left dominate the universities and culture and like basically everything. And
Yeah.
even despite that, they would. I mean, we're probably going to get crushed in the upcoming elections, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's that. I guess the thing is that when you look at new developments of left wing ideas, it's not like the 60s where you expect to see some like communes or some or new institutions that are doing this new thing, this new left wing idea. The only direction you imagine the left wing going is kind of more into that id pull stuff, right? And that's how it always seems, I suppose.
I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, right now the movement is in that direction, but it just seems like a cul-de-sac. I don't understand what can really be accomplished or what you can really do going in that direction personally. But it does feel kind of like a black hole in a sense, because something I find very frustrating about politics, one of the reasons that I don't like talking about it as much as I like discussing other things anyway, is that I'm way more concerned with like what is true and what is useful than what is optically good. But it seems like political discussions are almost completely subsumed by optics. And the problem with idpol is that a lot of the idpol arguments are very difficult to deal with optically. You kind of sound bad when you reject them, even though on their merits, they're fucking terrible arguments. But they are difficult to argue against optically. At least they're difficult enough that people haven't really been able to push back or mount any defense against them. But I don't think they're terribly popular. So when you say the left dominates everything, right? So idpol in particular, you can see elements of idpol basically everywhere. But I don't think those ideas are particularly popular, even though they are kind of everywhere.
Oh no, they never have been. No, but it doesn't matter. These things like affirmative action would be a good example. Affirmative action has consistently won politically, and it's never been popular. Mass migration has always won, and it's never been popular. All of these things have never been. It's not like they just got unpopular. They have never been popular since their inception in the late 70s and early 80s, and they keep on making institutional progress. There was this there's a blogger, Substacker by the name of Richard Hanania. I think that's how you pronounce his name. He's one of these, not ex progressives, but these anti-idpol progressives that you might call post-left. And he wrote a blog post, was it yesterday, about how, just like what you're saying right now, that the left has these rhetorical, well, I think, someone like Moscow would call them political formulas. They're just ways you can approach politics and win. And the title of the article was very provocative. I believe the title of the article was Female Tears Always Win in the Marketplace of Ideas. The point being was that you could just do, like, there's just certain images you can affect that just make absolutely no sense, but because the person saying them is expressing the right emotion in the moment, they just naturally kind of win and come to the forefront of a question over how power is going to be wielded.
Yeah, I mean, that's why crybullying is effective. But the thing is, crybullying doesn't win elections. Like, these things are able to win, like, little skirmishes, right? It's like they're very effective on Twitter. They're very effective in certain group settings. They might be effective at a party, but
they're effective. They're effective at, like, managing HR departments.
Yeah, they are. I'm just saying that they don't. I don't know that they translate into political power. The Democratic Party doesn't seem to want to do this for the most part. And if they were,
I guess, like, if you can keep an unpopular policy in play for 50 years, like mass migration or affirmative action, I mean, do you even need elections at that stage, right? Like if you can take like it's something that like the mass migration in particular is because not only has mass migration been always unpopular, it also has manifestly lost the right-wing power. Like without mass migration, the Democratic Party would have to be like, it would have to start, its far left branch would be like Hillary Clinton. Otherwise it would never win an election ever.
Well, what do you mean by mass migration? Because it's my understanding that American immigration policy was pretty conservative until like after 2012. I mean, even Obama's first term.
I'm talking about the 1965 Immigration Act that essentially massively increased the immigration to this country. So the history of United States immigration in broad strokes was that when the frontier was open, we had a very, very loose immigration policy, largely from Europe, largely for what you might call racist reasons or racialist reasons. That they wanted to keep the country predominantly European, with some exceptions. There were some other populations that were not classically considered European that came over as well. Then between 1919 and 1965, America had basically virtually a net zero immigration policy, or an immigration policy that increased the size of the population through immigration very, very slowly. I know this because my own parents immigrating from Eastern Europe could not get into America when they tried to immigrate in the late 40s. It was completely closed to them. It was impossible. And this was right after World War II, when America was looking to increase its population. And so like when you see post-1965 immigration, you see a massive change in immigration policy that is really unprecedented. And that's where you see like these big demographic upheavals where the country grows substantially more from immigration than it does from birth rates. Before that, America grew through birth rates. And after that, America grew through immigration. Yeah, it's called the Hart-Celler Act, if you look it up. And the Hart-Celler Act was unpopular when it was passed. It was unpopular, if you poll people on large demographic changing immigration, it was unpopular every single year it's ever been in effect. It's ever been taken out. And this is manifestly lost. Like this is manifestly captured power for the left. It took ideas, that couldn't. It allowed them basically to swing left across a 40-year time period.
And you're saying that this never really affected elections because nobody was like giving an alternative, even though
it affected elections. It was not affected by elections.
Okay.
So all I'm saying is I think you might I don't know. I mean, like, holding aside economics, obviously I tend to be much more left-wing on economics, strangely enough. Although, I would say that my economic theory is still sort of fundamentally closer to the Austrian school than something like Marxism or the Keynesian estrictness. Yeah. Still, I'm much more amenable to things like jobs programs and New Deal programs that are focused on health and just straight up job creation. But if you look at how this country has changed, I mean, it's changed a lot since the 90s. And those changes were not a result of elections. They were a result of institutional power shifts that consistently put more left-wing people in power and took people with right-wing opinions out over the course of like 40 years. And that's what really explains the change we've seen in terms of American culture.
I mean, yeah, there's a degree to which I don't think you can really contest that. I mean, like universities are almost homogeneously, like almost universally left-wing.
Yeah, that wasn't the case. Like when I was born, that wasn't the case.
Yeah.
I guess it was just starting to be the case when I was born, right? But like, just when you think of university professors actually being conservative or somewhat to the right of center on the early part of the 20th century, you just understand that what change has occurred, right? And that wasn't a result of an election, right?
Oh no.
And so I think that's I don't know. Like, for instance, like I think obviously the Democrats are going to win, or sorry, lose hard in the next two elections. I'm not so sure that's really going to change the trajectory we're on. Is that your impression as well?
I would bet heavily against the Democrats in 2022. I don't know about 2024. I mean, we don't even know if, I mean, it seems unlikely that Biden's even going to run. So I think it's kind of hard. It's pretty difficult to predict that. How exactly?
Yeah, I mean, who's actually, to me, Biden does not seem like he's masterminding his own administration's policy, right? So it's hard to say. Obviously, it's some contingent of the Democratic Party that's coming up with where the direction is going to go.
Well, I don't think elections are decided by policy.
Yeah, well, I don't think
I think that's a very dubious proposition. I mean, I've correctly predicted every election in my lifetime, and I don't put much of an emphasis on policy when I'm making those predictions.
I actually lost money. I bet against Trump winning.
Really? I won $50 on my man Donald Trump.
Oh man, I lost. I think I lost 100. So you're a better gambler than I am, I guess. I actually don't even really. As out of principle, I don't vote unless the election is very close, or there's some distinct issue, or there's something actually being decided. I try to stay out of it, especially since I tend to live in states that aren't particularly undecided one way or the other. Just because I don't like the theatrics of the electoral cycle, and
yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, where do you see this all going? I guess, right?
I mean, if Trump runs in 2024, I think he has a pretty good shot. If Trump doesn't run in 2024, I think Democrats are probably favored. Would be my guess. I mean, I don't see anyone else the Republicans could run that would really hold a candle to Trump. He seems to be a uniquely powerful political operator. I mean, that's why I bet on him in 2016. I mean, like Hillary Clinton couldn't fill a taco stand with her rallies, and Trump was filling stadiums 3 times a day. I mean, it seemed pretty obvious to me what direction the winds were moving in.
Yeah. I mean, well, I guess what I see is, in a more general sense, is I see a Democratic Party that's perennially unpopular, but has a better than 6% chance of winning any given election, just because of how things are set up, and the fact that because of how power is set up, it's very hard to consolidate an opposition candidate.
I mean, I don't think either party are particularly popular. I mean, most people, from my perspective, seem to engage basically in team sports. And the vast majority of the people that I talk to, they're going to support their side, but they all have some pretty substantial grievances with people on their side. Do you disagree with that?
Yes, although I don't think it's completely symmetrical. I think that the Democratic Party has a vision for changes they want to bring to America, and the Republican Party is a coalition of people who don't want those changes, or who want to deviate from the path that we're currently on in terms of changes. So for me, it's not like, oh, well, there's the Democrats, and Democrats hate their own guys, and there's Republicans, and radical Republicans hate their own guys. I think it's much more fundamental than that. I think that the Democratic Party is actually accomplishing a very radical change of how America operates. And then you basically have all the distance, all the malcontents, I should say. And the Republican Party is the party of general malcontents, and people from the hinterlands that don't have the ability to organize well against this stuff. And every now and again, the Democrats screw up, and they're able to ambush them, so to speak, and they temporarily get into office. But I don't see that actually manifesting in any kind of change. I don't see how, for instance, Trump really changed the country at all. And not the way that I think Barack Obama manifestly changed the tone of politics. His administration signaled something in our culture that brought on. You can really see it in sort of the id pool obsession that exploded after his second election in 2012. I think that had a large degree for his own workings behind the scenes. His sort of vision of how American politics should work is very much what we're living in post 2012.
I mean, I definitely think Obama changed things considerably more than Trump. That was something that annoyed me about Trump's presidency, is people were vastly overestimating how much Trump himself was actually doing. It seemed like not that much. I mean, you could talk about the tax cuts, or I don't know, trans-military stuff and bombing General Salami and shit. I know his name is Soleimani. It's just funnier to call him General Salami. But yeah, he didn't really do that much. I mean, he's more of like a figurehead. People just really, really, really like him.
And you know, his base hate him for those bombing campaigns too, right?
Yeah.
It's another strange thing is that the right wing base has gone hard against foreign intervention in the last 10 years. I think that's a very interesting development.
That is not something I would have expected 10 years ago. And the left wing seems more open to it, which is I've of my lefty friends, I've heard a surprising number of arguments in favor of foreign intervention, which is sort of interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it seems to be kind of going back to, you know, if we were looking on this on a broad perspective, it seems that there was this thing called the post-war consensus after 1945 that created the dynamic between Republicans and Democrats. And it seems like we're kind of undoing that these days. Back in the 1930s, knowing someone was right-wing might even be an indication that they're more isolationist than their left-wing counterparts. It wasn't until after the war that kind of reversed.
Yeah, I mean, usually for lefties, it wasn't necessarily an isolationism thing. It wasn't about like what's best for our country is to stay out of this bullshit. It's more of like a peacenik, like bombs are bad, man, don't kill people, man, sort of thing. I mean, that's how it always was with lefties when I was growing up. I mean, probably one of the biggest political, maybe the single biggest political issue was opposition to the Iraq War for people on the left. And you just don't.
I remember protesting that war when I was progressive.
Yeah, and people just don't give a shit anymore.
Well, I don't know. I think, you know, maybe, or maybe they're just maybe the wars are supporting the right people, right? I mean, if you go to the leftists in the 30s, they would have been pro or against the war, depending on whether we were fighting like Stalin or Hitler. And if it looked like we might enter into a war against one of Stalin's allies, they were against that war. And if it looked like we were going to enter the war against one of Hitler's allies, they were for it, right? So it was a very much que bono, basically, right? Who benefits? That was what determined the left wing idea on whether war was good or not. It wasn't a general. I don't think no serious leftist, maybe a few, maybe some Tolstoyans believed that, you know, war just generally always had to be avoided. But I think those were fairly few and far between when it came to the left.
Well, I mean, there's a substantial difference between World War II and like the Vietnam War. I mean, the Vietnam War was, I think, rightly seen as being pretty fucking unjust, right? And a lot of our skirmishes after World War II were seen as being pretty unjust or illegitimate or overly cruel, or however exactly you would want to phrase it. So the general opposition seemed to make sense. I mean, in World War II, there's a sensible reason that even someone who is generally speaking a pacifist and opposed to war would, you know, be moved to side with the idea of going to war.
Well, yeah, I mean, it didn't hurt it didn't hurt the Hitler declared war on the United States, certainly.
Yeah.
Right. But I mean, I wouldn't be the first right-winger to point out, though, that any justification to wipe Hitler out with a giant tank army could have also been a justification to wipe out Stalin with a giant tank army.
Sure. And yeah, lefties would have been opposed to that. Yeah. Marxism was a pretty big deal. It was still, it hadn't changed into something else yet. It was still pretty pure and quite prominent. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, do you see that Marxism is, to me, Marxism just always seems like it's the same. I mean, I guess it changes in its nature. Like it changes its narrative, and it sort of sweeps inconvenient theories like labor theory of value under the rug, which I think is kind of ridiculous. I don't know, maybe you agree with labor theory of value, but I never heard an explanation that I've really liked. But sort of its
No, it
MO
doesn't seem to make. It doesn't seem to make. I mean, nobody. I don't think anybody really supports it anymore. I mean,
yeah,
very
it
few
doesn't
people do
seem to
anyway.
be. It doesn't seem to be. Doesn't seem to fill what we would usually expect from a scientific theory. Yeah, I'm getting super chats. I see you guys. I'm going to answer them later. It doesn't fulfill what we usually want from a scientific theory, e.g., like coherence and predictability and stuff like that, and an explanation of how people operated in the past. But its MO in terms of how communists act, that seems like really consistent, right? It's largely it always consolidates its power among intellectuals and sort of disaffected aristocrats, or what they say in non-progressive circles, elite overproduction, right? People who are educated enough to be elites but aren't able to move into an elite position, and that's sort of communism's core audience. It was in the early 20th century, and it seems to be in the early 21st century. And then from there, it seems like it's more or less it operates on real politics, I guess.
Well, I mean, I would see it principally as being like a class-based workers' movement. I don't think it really is that anymore. At least the people who call themselves Marxists now don't.
Was it ever?
I mean, I would need to do some more reading about the 20s. I mean, my understanding was that there was a pretty strong workers' movement in like the early 1900s. And
there was.
It seemed to be
but,
much.
I mean,
It seemed to be much closer, at least, to the ideological roots of Marxism than what we have now. Where, I mean, it seems like if you express Marxist ideals, you get called a class reductionist, which is sort of like a very serious pejorative among lefties. The emphasis is completely different.
This is something like. Maybe this is a left-right split, but I don't see Marxist. There were lots of labor movements in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and these labor movements had, if you were just to randomly select them, you would not be able to easily characterize them as left-wing versus right-wing. A lot of them were super traditionalist, super tribal, and had distinct right-wing tendencies. The Marxist stuff, what characterized it as separate was that it had a huge elite contingent coming from disaffected aristocrats. Lenin was a disaffected aristocrat. A lot of the communists came from new money, and the first quite a prominent period after the communists took power, the Bolsheviks took power in Russia. They were waging a war against the White Russians. They were also waging a war against their peasants in the form of the sort of green Russian pushback. So I mean, like, I don't know. From my point of view, Marxism was never a workers' movement. It was an intellectual movement that attempted to conscript workers into it in more or less the same way that you can see modern day Marxists trying to conscript third world nationalism in the form of ID pool.
I mean, would you say that it used to present itself as a workers' movement?
Oh yeah. Oh, of course, yeah. Marx is very clear that this is a class-based movement and it's about the proletariat. Absolutely.
Yeah, I was just saying that element does not seem to be the case anymore. I mean, obviously, you need to be kind of an intellectual or a nerd to even think through problems such that you would end up caring a lot about it. It's not going to be something of the working man. And if you just show up at a union meeting, even nowadays, it's not a clear left-right thing. I mean, like you said, there's lots of socially conservative sentiment among union people. So I mean, that's kind of what I was getting at, is that the left doesn't care nearly as much about unions and workers' movements and just labor in general as they used to. I mean, there's some lip service there, but it's not something that really gets discussed that much, right? Like
What do you think the left does really care about?
I mean, largely identity politics a lot of the time, which is very frustrating to me. I mean, there is kind of the illusion of caring about working class people, but I think it's almost entirely fake. Like, did you see the whole nonsense that I got engaged with on Twitter recently? Did you see any of the details of what went on?
I just saw you getting piled on. It's had something to do with like welfare or something.
Yeah, so basically there was a discourse about whether or not food stamps should be restricted from buying unhealthy food. And I was saying that restricting food stamps to only buying healthy food would be better than allowing food stamps to be used on everything, which is kind of secondary to the point. At this point, I've talked about that so much, I don't really care to keep talking about it. And it's really not that important. But the reason people got mad at me was that I was seen as being condescending to workers. How dare you, or not even workers, condescending to poor people. How dare you tell poor people what they can spend their money on? What do you think poor people are so stupid that they can't make better decisions for themselves? Blah, 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 blah. Now, yes, I do think poor people are stupid because I think all people are stupid. I don't think people make particularly good decisions. I don't think that's controversial. In fact, I don't think anybody who disagreed with me disagreed with anything that I said, really. Because what was interesting was people would get really mad about things that I said, and then they would say things that implied exactly the same thing. For example, I would be saying, well, it's much better to cook. Cooking is healthier. Cooking is cheaper. If you get good at cooking, it doesn't even take as much time as it takes to go get fast food, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Everything about cooking is better. And then people would say, oh, but it's completely unreasonable to expect poor people to go learn how to cook. And it's like, well, do you really think poor people are so stupid they can't take 2 hours out of their fucking life at any point to go learn how to cook, right? You must think they're incredibly stupid. So, I mean, this is kind of a way that lip service is paid to the idea of sort of aesthetically, you need to respect poor people, but I don't think they do. I mean, I think these people that I was arguing with, they wanted to be seen as being aligned with poor people, but I think that they think less of them than I do. I don't see much evidence that the arguments that were being made against me really had anything to do with the best interest of anyone. I mean, you know, there's a conversation to have about the economics of the situation, or, you know, better or worse policies. But I don't think very many of these people are really motivated by what's in the best interest of poor people. And to be fair, neither am I. But I'm honest about it, and they aren't, right?
Well, I mean, I think, sir, the question is, you know, this is something that comes up a lot for me because, you know, I used to live in a big West Coast city, and I still do on occasion. I have family there, and if you live in a West Coast metropolitan area, the issue of homelessness is just primary. You can't walk around Seattle or Portland or San Francisco or Victoria. And I won't mention which of those cities are kind of closer to my heart, although anyone who watches this channel probably knows. Homelessness is just huge there. And it's all, I mean, we kind of confuse different issues of homelessness together. On one hand, you have homelessness, e.g., like the housing prices are just too high and families are forced out of their own homes, which is a big problem. And we need to confront that problem. But that's different from the homeless crisis as we know it from like vagrants, because the vagrant homeless crisis is almost all people who are schizophrenic and are killing themselves with drugs. And that never is part of the conversation. There has to be some understanding that we're going to save people from their own bad decisions.
Yeah, so that was another thing that we ended up getting into. And here's another interesting thing. So I spent 3 years as a researcher, and part of what I was doing was trying to alleviate homelessness. So I actually know a good deal about this. And the people I'm talking to are 12-year-old Twitter communists who don't know anything. And everyone would tell me how little I knew about the subject and how I was wrong about everything. Like, I'm going to tell you a statement. Mm-hmm. And I want you to tell me how controversial you think this statement is. Okay. If I were to take my present faculties and lose all of my possessions and lose all of my connections to people, and my net worth is set to 0 and I have nothing and I'm on the street, how long do you think it would take me to get out of homelessness?
Oh, would modern day resources be there?
Yeah, all of government programs that are set up to help homeless people are there, and I still have all of my skill set.
Yeah. Okay. If you have your skill set, like almost no time.
Yeah, so I said 3 months, and everyone lost their fucking mind, and that is a very conservative estimate.
Yeah, they're not aware of the main barriers of homelessness. The main
That,
barriers
that's
of homelessness are these people have uh, it sometimes through no fault of their own. These people have massive mental limitations,
that's
either brought on by
exactly,
chemical
yep.
abuse or brought on by
Well, there's
congenital
I mean,
things like
there's
schizophrenia.
basically there's two very different types of homeless people. So one thing that people don't know is that 80 to 90% of people in the US who become homeless get out of it in less than a year. Those are the people who don't have schizophrenia. And then the remaining 10% of people, like you said, it is a very difficult problem to address because you could just give them a house and that wouldn't fix the problem. And that's another thing that I said. And again, people just lost their fucking mind. But these aren't controversial statements. If you actually,
These people could volunteer in an urban housing community, and they would immediately understand this. If you clean, I used to do volunteering work at homeless shelters, and if you have to clean up and repaint these rooms, you realize the state these people are living in, and you realize that if you gave them a house, that would be a danger to them if they don't have people that are literally taking care of them.
yeah, I mean, it's a much more complicated problem than that. But the only way that a lot of people seem capable of processing this is we should have empathy for homeless people. And if you say anything that implies that homeless people could do anything to stop being homeless under any circumstances, well, you're just being a douchebag to homeless people. And saying that now, it sounds like a straw man, but this is what almost everyone that I talk to, including some people that I respect, said. They just don't seem capable of even engaging with the question. Like, I don't think the idea that a person without medical or mental problems could escape homelessness in a couple of months is even vaguely controversial. That's, as far as I'm concerned, it's basically an empirical fact. That's probably what's going to happen, unless something else is tacked on. If you have dependence, it's harder. If you have mental problems, it's much harder. If you have medical problems, it is substantially harder.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, people, I don't know. I don't think that people actually care about these things. I think people care about projecting the image of being someone who cares about them.
Oh, yeah, this is Twitter politics for you, right? This is
Yeah, but I mean, it's not just, that's the thing, is it's not just limited to Twitter. So like, I don't know. I obviously I call myself doomer. I am rather pessimistic. I think that Twitter is a pretty decent reflection of the real world in a lot of ways, more so than a lot of people like to think.
well, this gets me back to what a lot of one of my more right-wing friends said this on his Telegram account, and I won't tell you who because I don't want to get you in trouble. He said something that a lot of right-wing people feel, and that is that the world's just not meant for people to engage in politics like this. These people, they're gravitating to politics because they want something like religion, or they want a community to be part of. They're not gravitating towards politics to discuss like Hobbes or Italian elite theory versus Marxism or anything like that. And to the extent that they attach those titles to themselves, it largely is to create an identity out of it, right?
Yeah, I mean, very few people are really particularly interested in actually doing research and understanding things. And I don't necessarily even include myself in that, to be honest with you.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
mean, I'm very wary of research because, I think that this whole deciding studies thing is like I think that's been really toxic to our discourse.
in a way. So, what in terms of my advantages of talking about politics, I'm not the most educated person. But one thing I'm very good about is not arriving at judgments before I do a good deal of research. So, if you were to go down a list of policies and ask me my opinion on probably 50 to 60% of the issues, I would just not have an opinion, which I think is a tremendous virtue. If you're capable of not having an opinion until you look into something and actually understand what's going on, the probability that you have a really fucking stupid opinion is much lower. So if you're capable of reserving judgment and waiting until you actually do some reading before you form an opinion, then studies are incredibly useful. But if you're the kind of person, like most people online, and you already have a judgment, and all you're doing is going to imright.com to find the piece of paper that says that you're right, then it's just completely caustic to the discourse. Because, I mean, again, I could use the example of talking about homelessness, but people just assume they're right, and they'll just like Google one thing and they'll cite it without even reading it. And in my experience, the easiest way to win an internet argument is just to read the sources that the person you're talking to gives, because no one ever seems to read them. And it's
but
like
it's a bigger problem than that, right? Because the problem isn't reading the sources. The problem is the questions that these academic communities are even asking. So I mean, I'll take an example. There's a bunch of controversial scientific, like where I come down sort of against what's ordinarily considered the consensus, even though it's not necessarily the scientific consensus. Probably the least, one of the lesser controversial ones is global warming. So, I obviously believe global warming is happening. You can go into a lab and you can do experiments with greenhouse gases, and you can see that more greenhouse gas means more warming and all that stuff, right? And when I was a progressive, I did a lot of research into this, and I verified all the facts. And then I started engaging with skeptics, and what I discovered was not that my facts were wrong, but just that like certain critical questions were left out of the entire analysis. And so like what you engaged in when you engaged with sort of the progressive version of the global warming was this constant circling around like 5 or 6 questions. And they would never sort of break the frame and go out of those questions. It's like certainly the most important question that I never heard any progressive mention was the relative sensitivity of the climate to carbon dioxide or any greenhouse gas, and whether we have a reason to believe that relationship is linear, logarithmic, or exponential. And like that's like critical, and like I've never heard any progressive mention it. Like I took like multiple classes where teachers explained the science behind this, and it was just not there. And it wasn't there because that was sort of that it broke the answer to that question, kind of broke the narrative. And so like when you start asking new questions, you kind of get like I don't know, you don't get kind of like an answer. Like there's no amount of research papers that you can do to resolve this. It has to be more of just the tools we bring to the table in terms of thinking about this problem.
Well, global warming might be a bad example there because it's just a tremendously fucking complicated thing. The thing that frustrates me about the global warming conversation is that people think that global warming is like a series of 2 questions. And there's like 2 questions that basically everyone agrees on, right? But then there's 20 follow-up questions. And for like 3/4 of them, there isn't even a consensus among scientists on really what the correct answer is. We don't know exactly what's happening, or sorry, we don't know exactly why things are happening. We definitely don't know what to do about it. The policy implementation of the best method of responding to things seems very murky. The models that are used to predict things are quite complicated. And like you said, I had looked into some of the relationships between like what are the relative levels of importance of different greenhouse gases. What I found to be quite a bit odd was that the overt fixation is on CO2, when it seemed from my research like fluctuations in water vapor might be just as relevant.
Well, water is more relevant, but the problem is they can't model water.
Yeah. So
because
exactly.
water's not homogeneously distributed, right? Because when water is in the form of vapor, it is a greenhouse gas. But if it coalesces and forms a dense cloud cover, it basically reflects light back into the stratosphere, right? And so since you can't get an understanding of how it's distributed, you can't get an understanding of its overall effect. And it's little questions like that should be so prominent in determining like how decided this question is, that just are completely left out. And you can research the relative certainty of the questions that the sort of activists like asking and answering over and over again, that won't get you a different perspective or even necessarily the right way to deal with this problem.
I mean, in the case of global warming, I think you're probably right, but I don't think that's true for a lot of issues. I mean, some issues are somewhat simple. Global warming, I think, is just a massively complicated thing where, I mean, I got the impression that I could spend all of my time researching it for 5 years and not really arrive at any serious conclusions.
I've seen
It just seems
enough to
horrendously complicated.
I've seen enough global warming stuff for me to believe that. Well, first of all, I fully acknowledge that on the basic 5 questions you always get from activists, the consensus is actually right. But once you go away from that to a lot of necessary questions that would be absolutely necessary to spend money to solve it, the idea that this is sort of a consensus, like the science is settled, it just becomes bizarre and an absolute misrepresentation. There's no way a science like this could be settled in the way that they're implying.
Yeah, the example I would use for reference would be nutrition.
Yeah, that's a good one. I guess that's a good one.
Yeah, because nutrition is notoriously absurdly difficult to conduct good studies. And as far as I can tell, the existing research is just like, I mean, basically dog shit. No matter what perspective you have. So like some people would support vegetarian or plant-based diets. Some people would support low-carb diets. Some people would support calories in, calories out. There's a bunch of different perspectives. And regardless of which perspective you have, you could cite 500 studies that would say that you're correct. And there just doesn't seem to be a consensus at all. There are substantial numbers of credentialed people on basically every side of the argument. And as far as I can tell, there just isn't, I mean, just don't eat McDonald's. Like, I don't know. Like there's certain things we can all agree are bad. Bread's probably pretty bad.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, I mean, like, what is the ideal balance of macronutrients? I don't think anyone has a clue.
Well, what would you consider like to be? You said that there were some political questions where sort of this study-based approach might actually work. I'm kind of curious about that.
Sure. Well, I guess there are, in terms of policy, certain things are pretty simple. Like guns in the US, for example, I think there's just not really any way to move in one direction or the other politically. But it's not really a scientific question. It's a question of political pragmatism. You're never going to see serious gun control, and you're never going to see McNukes, right? And the realm of movement that's possible is very, very narrow. If you mean in terms of like applying studies, applying science to try and solve political questions, I would need to think about it. I'm sure there are examples.
I mean, gun control is a perfect example because most progressives see gun control as anti-violent crime policy, and my response is I just don't think that gun control is anti-crime policy or effective.
I think in my experience, gun control is less popular among progressives than you might imagine. It seems to be one of the more, like, if I had to list off 5 conservative policies that you would actually hear someone on the left arguing for, like the right-wing position on guns might be number 1. Like there's a lot of lefties that have a pretty conservative position when it comes to guns. And I don't think I've met anyone that's super in favor of gun control, where it's like way up on their list. But some people are pretty passionate about it. And I think it's kind of dumb given how impossible it is to make any progress. It's just not going to happen. Like I don't know how you feel about this, but I'm a pretty pragmatic person. If something is just never going to happen in my lifetime, I just don't see a reason to think about it, regardless of how good or bad it might be.
I guess so. I mean, I definitely worry a lot about the next 200 years in terms of society completely falling apart, right?
Well,
I don't. Catastrophic. To give credit to the global warming activists, I do think society should be thinking about what our children are going to be facing in 200 years. I just don't. I think that their risk assessment when it comes to the risks of a lot of other things are I don't think they're doing the risk assessment right, I guess is what I'm saying. And it's sort of it's about the priorities that I think are the big deal. I mean, for right wingers, I think crime and social disorder are a much bigger deal, and maybe that's going to change too, right? I mean, one thing I guess I was kind of I feel that we're sort of in the need of a political realignment in this country, but I don't think it's going to happen, and that's what I was saying before when I kind of misscheduled the stream. Is it would be so easy to sort of realign politically and sort of incorporate some right-wing messages into sort of like a big tent ruling party and sort of restore sanity. But I don't think anyone's going to do that, right? And
well, that's been true for a long time. I mean, there's certain issues that if someone on the left took them up, I mean, it's very easy to imagine how there could be a real political winner, but it just never happens. I don't know exactly why, but it just never happens.
Yeah, I mean, you see that. Like, I think that there might be like the left is never going to go against mass immigration. I'm convinced of that. That will never. I mean, it used to be a staple of leftism, or not a staple, but something it would be very common to see an anti-immigration left winger in the early 21st century, but they just don't exist in the early 21st century for some reason. And so there's that. But one exception to this is you think that the left wing might flip on crime, that they might change their opinion on how to confront crime in light of what we've seen over the last 2 years.
Well, I mean, one thing is that crime had been steadily getting better up until the fucking COVID. So, I mean, at the very least, that's a hopeful topic where.
You mean from like when we started cracking down in the 90s, yeah. Crime spiked up in the 70s, right? Like that's when we had our huge turbo spike of crime in the 60s and 70s. And then since then we've been on this historically high crime, and then we just started basically throwing people in jail in the 80s and 90s, and that got us to where we were in the 2000s, right?
The criminal justice policies really started ramping up, I think, in the 50s, and the biggest spike in criminal justice policy was in the 90s in terms of locking people up and getting tough on crime and shit like that.
Yeah, that's my impression too.
I think, but the actual crime rates had steadily declined, and it's not just a strict enforcement. Prison populations have declined since.
Well, this is. I think we are really disagreeing at this point. My impression was that basically we've only been. I guess it depends on what you mean by this generally declining. You mean we just had like a slam up in the 70s and 80s?
No, I mean prison populations have been declining since 2002, like steadily, and crime rates I think across the country have been declining since approximately the same period. I mean,
so, yeah, that's definitely possible. But I mean, so is your impression that sort of like the solution to crime is basically the policy we had from 2002 to 2018?
I mean, it's difficult to say exactly what the solution to crime is, or even what the left-wing policy is necessarily, because there's this image of the left being all about restorative justice and shit, but I don't think that's very popular among politicians, really.
I'm just asking if it works, right? I mean, if restorative justice can stop the crime surge, then like let's do restorative justice.
I mean, there's a bunch of different individual policies. So one thing people would want to talk about is like the level of police involvement. I don't think that movements, I don't think that getting rid of police is politically, it politically can't happen. It also doesn't make any sense. What might make sense is to shift. You
mean totally get rid of police? We certainly have.
Well, even
sort of like
even curtailing them. Well, even curtailing them, because like in particularly high, like first of all, crime isn't that bad in most areas. It's pretty concentrated in specific areas, and in the areas where it's concentrated, generally speaking, you want more police because you want to protect the people who live in those areas from criminals. I mean, the idea of okay, we have a city and there's a lot of crime and we're just going to get rid of the fucking police is insane.
Well,
Like you would
we
just be
did decrease
subjecting
it.
the
We did decrease discretional policing significantly in the last 2 years.
yeah, I mean, I see that as being not particularly a good thing. And that's probably not a very popular left-wing position, but I mean, these people need to read some more. I mean, people have these romantic ideas about just getting rid of the police. People have some really delusional ideas about the adverse effects of policing. There are serious problems with policing in the country. There's ways policing could be better, but I don't think you solve that by taking away their funding and getting rid of police. It just seems to be ridiculous and moving completely in the opposite direction of what needs to happen. I mean, you probably need to increase police funding because you probably need to get better policemen. Is my guess, but you definitely can't just get rid of them. I mean,
Yeah,
I don't.
attracting people these days is going to be really hard.
Yeah,
the recruitment for places like rock bottom.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a fun job. I mean, the one thing is they get paid decently, but it's. I mean, on the one hand, some people will exaggerate how dangerous being a police officer is. It is approximately as dangerous as delivering pizza on like a your likelihood to get killed basis, but there's a lot of emotional stress that goes into the job, and it's just generally speaking not very fun. In general, I think that probably the problem with policing has to do with corrupting incentives within police departments and just a general low quality of people that are on the force, not the fact that police exist at all. Like, I would be more in favor of like getting better police and doing what you can to make sure that you don't have really fucked up police departments, because there are a couple of instances where police departments have fostered some pretty fucked up environments, but that's not, I think, a systemic problem with police in most instances. It's like you just have one area that's fucked and you need to go like sort that shit out. In terms of prison, I mean, we'd have to go into a whole conversation. I mean, I actually was a criminal justice researcher for a while, so I could talk about the various things that you could do. Within policy practicality, the most important thing for correctional reform is to figure out ways for people to successfully re-enter society. Basically, if you let someone out of prison, make sure they don't go back to prison, because right now the vast majority of people end up going back to prison, and it's not entirely their fault, to be honest. We have kind of the system is set up such that they're somewhat likely to go back to prison for a variety of reasons. So I mean, I'm somewhat in favor of, I'm pretty in the direction of like restorative justice.
What is restorative? Can you clarify what that means? I don't really have a firm understanding. I mean, I know vaguely.
Sure. So unfortunately, this is one of these terms where a lot of people use it different ways. So no matter what I say, someone is going to be like, you used the term wrong. And it's just a whole lot of fun.
I'm not Marxist. You can give me a general definition.
I'm just saying that this is one of these times, right? So some people say restorative justice, some people say reformative justice. Basically, the idea is that you want to try and instead of the purpose of the criminal justice system being punitive, you want to fix the problem of crime. If you have a punitive criminal justice system, it's like, okay, you were bad, I'm going to hit you with a stick and put you in a cage, and you're going to sit in timeout. And the purpose of you being in timeout is just to punish you for being a bad boy. It's not to try and fix the problems of society. The general aim of restorative or rehabilitative justice is to try and fix the problem of crime in society. So how do we get people that commit crime to stop committing crime? And how do we reduce the general rates of crime in the country? A lot of people,
a right winger will instantly say that this is basically the attitude we've been trying to apply since the 60s, and they would say that, like, since we've been doing this, the crime rates, I mean, what's the probability we could have the crime rate we had in like 1951, for instance?
Well,
or
I mean,
1931?
that definitely is not the attitude of, I mean, criminal justice policy throughout the 70s to 90s to 2000s.
In the 90s, in the 80s and 90s, the big crackdown, like the Giuliani crackdown, you could see that as sort of a reaction against sort of the attitude of the 60s and 70s. But I guess, like, maybe we could just take like the ideology out of it. I want to have like Japan or 1950s crime rate. That would be ideal. Is that? I mean,
I mean, I think, okay, so if there are two very, very, very different questions. One of them is, how do you prevent crime from happening? The other one is, how do you respond when crime happens? So I've done enough reading to be very confident that when you have someone who enters the criminal justice system, the thing that I care about is, how do we stop you from committing future crimes?
Yes.
If you have a punitive criminal justice system, when someone enters the system, they are just going to stay in the system for the rest of their life, and that's not good for anyone. Being in prison is fucking expensive. It's not. I mean, like it's not a good solution for people to just have a rotating population of people that stay in prison
No,
and periodically get out.
I don't
and fuck
want to
shit up
have
and
a
go to prison.
people. I don't
Yeah.
want people in prison
So-
to have people in prison, right?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
You know,
So like,
even if you're a right winger and you're like Carlyle and you think punitive punishment is essential, you know, I would much rather have it be something quick and get them back into the productive society. You know,
So, yeah,
and
the things
so
that
you know, I don't want people to just stay in the system. I guess, you know, I see these cities that are highly progressive, and this idea, the way you described restorative justice, this is absolutely not a new idea. This has been sort of like the operative idea in progressive.
yeah, I didn't present it as a new idea.
So,
I mean, I was
question
reading about the history.
How is this not working? Because it doesn't appear the highly progressive areas are really making this work very well.
Well, like I said, there's two very different questions. I think it is proven to be quite effective in terms of responding to people who are in the system. Based on my reading, it is effective there. Now, in terms of the question of how do you prevent crime happening in the first place, that's another global warming type, absurdly complicated problem that isn't. It's just very, very difficult to address. It's like a very complicated sociocultural thing. In certain areas, I mean, first of all, I don't have the answer. If I knew, you know, I would be in a position to make a lot of money, I suppose, or get a lot of fame or something like that. But there are certain areas. I mean, some of it just can't be prevented. If someone with an anger problem comes home and finds some guy banging their wife, you're going to have crime. There's always going to be some level of crime, but it's particularly concentrated in certain areas that have socio-economic problems. And it's, I mean, I think it's a very, very complicated issue. You would need to solve the socio-economic factors that lead to these areas being high in crime. And it's like, I don't know exactly what the solution is going to be. It might be that the solution is just take all the people in these areas and bust them all to different cities and just abandon these areas. Maybe that would work. I don't know. I don't like what exactly.
I mean, this is the problem. Like, you think that the areas, like, there's something about the area that's the problem?
Well, it's
like,
not the area. It's the environment. I mean, if you have a bunch of people.
Wait, what's in the area and the environment? It's the same thing.
Sure.
I mean, if you move the population, very likely the crime would move with the population, right?
Not necessarily. I mean, I don't think the problem is necessarily the people. I mean, like, okay, if there's an impoverished area and there aren't jobs, and you know that the best way you could make money is by selling drugs, then your likelihood of selling drugs is going to increase. If you move to a different area where there is available, you know, jobs, and your labor can, you know, get a high demand, and you don't have a problem getting a well-paying job, well, then your likelihood of dealing crack goes down substantially, right? So, I mean, I don't think it's that.
I think you're making some assumptions. You know,
well, what assumptions?
Obviously, you're making the assumption that these people don't have. I mean, I'm not saying it's necessarily their fault or not, right? But let's take our initial example of homelessness that we started with, right? I mean, like, you know, these people who are killing themselves with heroin in San Francisco or fentanyl, right? Like, you could move them to Tennessee and they kill themselves with fentanyl there.
Well, that's different. I mean,
but I don't think it. My core contention is that it's not always different. A lot of the things that cause crime are not necessarily anyone's fault. I'm not saying it's anyone's fault, right? Or maybe it is, but maybe it isn't, right? Like, I don't think homelessness is people's fault, but like, you can't just take fentanyl addicted homeless person in San Francisco, like, bus them to Fresno, and then, like, problem solved. Like, no, that's not going to work, right? And the same thing is true for a lot of crimes. Like, these people have deep personal problems in their own lives that have been caused by a variety of things, some their fault and some not. And I think you should try to fix those problems as much as you can. But, I've come to believe that the area might not be the explanation for why this is going on.
In some cases, sure. It's going to be, well, okay. So a lot of violent crime in the United States is caused by basically gang warfare. Gang warfare results from like socioeconomic stuff. Yeah, like drugs coming from poorer areas. That seems to me to be pretty preventable. I don't know exactly how you prevent it, but it seems like something that we should be able to address. There are a lot of crimes that aren't going to be addressable. I mean, there's like, I find it somewhat frustrating to talk to people who are like prison abolitionists, because there are a certain number of people that just are going to be rascals, right? Like, there's just not much you can do about it. It doesn't really matter how good their life is or what their environment is. They're going to get up to no good, and you need a method of addressing them. And there's a certain percentage of the population, which isn't particularly high, but are just dangerous fucking lunatics. And I mean, they need to be put in a box. And I say that as someone who is very far in the direction of being a prison reformer, but you can't just get rid of prisons. It's never going to happen. There's always going to be a certain number of people like that. But I think a lot of people who engage in violence, I can conceive of a world where that's prevented. I mean, there are other countries that don't have this problem, right? I don't think it's a unique
like
American
Japan
thing.
Right? Or, I mean, Singapore doesn't, right? Singapore dealt with it.
Singapore has their own way. I mean, yeah, in Singapore, if you spit out gum, they basically come over with a fucking bat and beat the shit out of you and put you in a box. So, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't go to Singapore and, fuck shit up.
Yeah, I mean, they got results. I'll say that, right?
I mean, they got results. There might be a cause. I don't know. I haven't been to Singapore. I hear it's nice, I guess.
No, I mean, Singapore, I mean, given where they started, it's impressive what they accomplished. I'm just saying, right?
Yeah. I mean, would you characterize Singapore as being like acutely authoritarian?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But for me, crime, like, this is a very right-wing view, and people are making fun of me for constantly announcing that everything I say is right-wing before I say it, like I'm somehow qualifying it on my own channel. But for myself and for a lot of other people on the right, crime is a form of tyranny and authoritarianism. It's just a disorganized one. Every criminal act is an attempt to establish a miniature tyranny, and gangs are miniature tyrannies. So if you live in a neighborhood dominated by a gang, you effectively don't live in a free society. You live under the tyrannical domination of that gang.
Sure.
And so, the idea, the idea that you can call crime policy ineffective, and you can call it excessive to the extent that it causes harm and damage in excess to what it would prevent. But it can't in the abstract be authoritarian if it curtails the authoritarian behavior that it all effectively.
I mean, I would be concerned about, like, basically the rate of false positives, right? It's like, if you want to have tough on crime policies, I'm personally not really super opposed to tough on crime policies, as long as the results that you're getting is that we're able to prevent and address crime, and that we don't have, serious externalities for people who aren't criminals.
False positives undermine the faith that a population has in the criminal justice system. That is absolutely the case. I guess, I guess that is actually that is some criticism from the left I would definitely take on board, which is that, having a light touch has its place from a right-winger's point of view. Yeah, okay, they got me in the chat on this one. Largely because any kind of false positive undermines the credibility of the promise. which has to be defended above all other things, is the promise that societies make to their citizens.
Yeah, I mean, like some people on the left really go overboard, basically just assuming that any interaction with the police is just like basically a lynching. And unfortunately, most of the recent interactions with police that have been highly publicized have been really grossly I mean, obviously, I'm mostly known for a video where I'm talking about like Jacob Blake, for example.
Mm-hmm.
An instance where I think that use of force was just, I mean, kind of uncontroversially justified. I don't really know how anyone familiar with the facts of the case could really argue otherwise. But a lot of people who would be seen as being on the left are just reflexively against it. And I think it's unfortunate because, I mean, I see myself as being pretty far in the direction of like criminal justice reform, but you can't just be reflexively against everything. That's the problem that people on the left often have, in my experience. And any interaction with the police that seems even slightly not above board will sort of be blown out of proportion. If you look at the statistics, things aren't as bad as they could be, but there's always a risk with policies of really fucking bad shit happening. Like, for example, I'm pretty afraid of the police breaking into my house. It's not because I'm afraid of something happening to me. I would assume that I would be fine, but I would also assume that there's a good chance my dog gets shot, right? I don't like that. I find it to be very uncomfortable. I would rather they not shoot my dog, right? Because I'm not a criminal, I'm not particularly worried about anything else, but that's just an externality that exists. And if you have the cops running around, you know, knocking at everyone's doors, a lot of people are going to have their pets shot. This is the kind of thing that people are not going to like to deal with. Obviously, a lot of times it's not going to be people's pets. A lot of times innocent people are going to get shot. If that happens enough times, it becomes a really fucking massive problem. I mean, obviously, it happening at all is not acceptable. But if it happens,
I'll agree with you. You know, the police raids are really scary, and you see things that are questionably abusive, and like you can very much empathize with the people who are on the opposite end of those things. I absolutely acknowledge that.
That's my biggest problem with like increasing basically the police's willingness to. I'm somewhat skeptical in some cases of increasing the enforcement in certain areas because it seems like the increase in false positives might be a problem. Yeah.
I guess what everyone's trying to do really is rediscover how we rebuild sort of high trust communities, because there's just been a marked decline in social cohesion. And a lot of these areas, like we're attempting to strong arm police them because we can't rely on the social order itself to prevent crime from occurring. Someone in the chat said, you know, a lot of these gang activity is popular because gang activity is high status in these communities.
There's a lot of reasons that gang activity is popular. I mean, part of it is that if your family unit is obliterated, the gang is what's it called?
Surrogate family.
Surrogate family. Yeah.
That's another thing too, right? I mean, like, so you're trying to solve the absolute decline of the family unit by police. That's not going to work.
Yeah, I mean, gangs are also a way to make money. Gangs are a way to be protected. I mean, in prison, it's like an enormous thing. You have to be very, very cognizant of gang activity when you're a criminal justice researcher. And I mean, there's just a fuckload of reasons that people join gangs, unfortunately. So yeah, it's a very difficult thing to deal with as long as you have an economic environment where people are impoverished. It's just going to be a thing that happens basically, from what I can tell anyway.
You know, we probably want to transition away from crime because there's one topic I wanted to cover before we start answering super chats or questions from the chat. And, you know, I guess if I were to kind of like, you know, this is the clip that everyone tries to cancel me with on the left is kind of hilarious because it's something like it catches me saying something I genuinely believe, which is that there needs to be an alliance between the far left and the far right. Now, obviously, like truth be told, right? Like I'm going to show my hand here. I don't think progressive policies are sustainable in the long term. So, I'm fully expecting that through peaceful discourse, if there was a political alliance of this sort, the right wing ideas would more or less dominate. But that being said, the one of my main projects on this channel, and one was secretly exposed as wanting from a Discord conversation, is trying to find an area of post-leftism where I almost say the far left, but certain elements of the radical left and the radical right could come together and kind of agree on a vision. And I think what I get this sense, and I probably will talk about this a lot more in 2022. What right wingers want more than anything else is an ability to create a society that's going in a different direction than the universities want to go in. Like the universities and the HR departments and the media has a certain vision of where how humanity should organize itself and how it should operate and how it should be controlled at a global scale. And right wingers want some ability to create a separate piece and go in a different direction than that vision. That's kind of, I would say, more than anything else in terms of the temporal, you could argue what's right wing and what's not. But that desire is what you see undergirding most of people who are passionately right wing. And one thing I've noticed about the left is that they've gone from being highly supportive of sort of like alternative lifestyle communities to being highly skeptical of them. And to the extent where, I could, as a right winger, I could just say, like, I have this preference to live my life in this traditionalist fashion. I want to live like a Mormon or an Orthodox Jew or maybe an Amish person with some more technology, right? And I get the sense that, I'm not so sure this is true everywhere on the left, but it's true in a lot of places on the left where they're deeply threatened by this proposition. They're deeply threatened with this idea that there would be a segment of society that would organize itself in an independent fashion and want to go in a different cultural direction than, say, like, the LGBTQ community or the general direction of most university departments, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just curious about your thoughts on that, or, what's your sense about how people feel about things like that?
The first thing I would say as a branding thing is you really shouldn't say you want an alliance between the right and the left. The people that would be considered far left, more than anything else, they want to not be associated with people on the right. So that's.
But why is that, though? Why do you think that? Like, I don't have any problems being associated with. Well, obviously, I'm going to disagree, right? But if people are like, oh, he makes alliances with communists, I'll be like, oh, okay, well, we all are working together to support, to pick a random example out of my hat, the Canadian truckers, right? They're all workers. So, I'm standing with the communists as we honk for workers' rights for medical autonomy in the nation that's my second home, which is Canada.
If you want the honest answer, it's because everybody's a political hobbyist and it's just team sports. It's not really a serious thing. And like the way that people gain clout, the way people gain attention and sort of signal their factional alliances by rallying against the evil rightoids. There are legitimate reasons that people on the left are, generally speaking, not going to like people on the right. The problem is assuming that anybody on the right is going to have any particular thing that you find objectionable that's coming from right-wing people.
I feel there's a certain amount of fear, actually.
Yeah, it's beyond fear. You can see this in the Vosh video that I made. It's like straight up dehumanization. A lot of people on the left don't see people on the right as even being human. The most effective attack that left-wingers use against each other is to say that you are a centrist or a right-winger. If you talk to someone who's a socialist, the worst thing you can be to a socialist is a liberal. It's just a factional warfare thing. So if you want to be even vaguely successful, you would want to, as best you can, avoid any of that language. But there are some people on the left. I mean, there's certain things like pro-life movements in the left seem to be becoming more popular, for example.
Really? That's
Yeah,
amazing.
there's a number that's one of the areas where it seems like there's a massive potential to gain like a political win that just has never happened. I mean, there are activist movements within the left, but there's no politicians, to my knowledge, anyway. No politicians with any serious power that are actually pushing that. But it is a thing that exists. I think you're right, generally speaking, that there's a pretty severe hostility to any form of cultural or ideological enclave. I mean, a lot of people on the left are basically engaged in a kind of ideological warfare. I mean, that's I've talked to a lot of people who are really happy to talk to, like, people that are on the right and somewhat far on the right in some cases, that are really happy to talk to me. I think the main reason is just that I'm not engaged in that warfare. I don't care. It's like I'm.
So someone in the chat, we're probably going to answer super chats the next 5 minutes, but someone in the chat says the left won't leave you alone because they want your stuff. I don't think they do want my stuff. I think it's my theory about this, right? And my theory is it's pretty simple. I think that what the left doesn't like about the right is, let's say that, I have my right-wing Catholic community, and Vosh has his left-wing anarchist community. And we take the island of Manhattan, and we treat it like the island of Haiti. We draw a line down the middle, and we just run our communities for 30 years, based on our principles. I think what the left secretly, I don't know if this is a conscious fear, but my suspicion is the left fears that if this experiment were run in 30 years, it would be like the Eloy and Morlock from the Time Machine, and the right would emerge from this process insanely more powerful, possibly vindictive, and probably richer. And the left feels that if they accede to separatism, they lose the ability. It's like they have a wolf in it's like they have a wolf in a chokehold, right? And if they let the wolf go, the wolf is going to kind of get its bearing, turn around on him, and just wring his neck. And so they can't let go of the wolf. And that's what I get the sense of with the left wing, is they feel like they've caught something that's very, very powerful, and they've kind of checkmated it. They kind of pinned it down. And they can't let that pinned thing unpin itself, and that seems to be. And maybe this is me psychologizing left, and I could be way out of line doing this. But listening to people talk about the right wing, that's the sense I get.
I mean, I think for the most part, people just think that they have the correct way for society to be run, and they want everyone to run their way because it's right. I mean, I think that's what's going on in people's heads.
Wouldn't we see how great left-wing society is and willingly join the left, though? I mean, it seems like that.
I mean, is Saudi Arabia going to voluntarily join the left? I mean, if you think that like liberal democracy and progressive values and stuff like that are the correct way to live, then it's not necessarily the case. Other people are just necessarily going to adopt it. I mean, you could easily imagine a foreign power that would stand to benefit from oppressing their people. And somebody on the left would be like, oh, we need to go liberate those people. I mean, it seems like a completely natural impulse if that was your way of thinking.
So I have no desire to liberate Saudi Arabia from Saudi Arabian values. And I do. I have a different religion than them, but short of preaching at them, I really don't have any desire to, politically checkmate them and
I don't think
triangulate them into some kind of position where they have to. We're teaching a Muslim classroom of kids Catholic values. That seems like that's not what I have in mind. I guess
it might just be a temperamental difference between people on the left and people on the right, because it does seem to be the case that people on the right are more so just wanting to be left alone to do their own thing. Whereas people on the left are a lot more active about wanting to convert people, and actively change things in their vision of what would be a better future. Maybe it's a temperamental difference in general.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't always like this, and if that is a temperamental difference, it is a temperamental difference by which the left is superior to the right. Because my friend Aaron McIntyre presented a tweet a few days ago that has gotten retweeted 1 billion times, and he said the political side that wants to rule will always be victorious over the political side that wants to be left alone.
Yeah,
and
I mean,
I think he's right about that.
That's a decent idea. Yeah,
but I mean, in some sense, that is depressing, because that means that, by the time, unless you believe that history is just always going to go left, but by the time the left-wing ideas are turned back, or we as a species do something different than just go in the direction of leftism, the right will be something that is much less amenable to compromise than it is right now. And to me, it just seems kind of tragic, right?
I mean, I'm not sure that history always does go left, honestly. I mean, certainly in the U.S., it generally speaking has, if you're talking about in terms of social issues.
I consider social issues to be the only... I don't think economic issues are so clearly left versus right. I think it's mainly what kind of gives you the consistent understanding of left versus right are predominantly the social issues, and predominantly the questions about the enforcement of rules and norms, I guess. And I guess now I'm kind of famous for I not originated this idea, and I don't even think the person I did the video on originated this idea. But it's been very clear that for the last 200 or 300 years, we've been going in sort of a nominally left-wing direction as a planet.
Socially, yeah. I mean, I would say that is generally speaking a good thing, but perhaps you disagree about some of that.
I would think it's not. I mean, obviously some rules and regulations need to die, but I would highly call into question the last 100 years of this renegotiation. And I'm not somebody who thought that the order... I don't want to bring back the order of the early 20th century by any means, but we threw out a lot of stuff. We destroyed a lot of stuff that it's going to take us hundreds of years to bring back. My favorite example of this is like sexual dynamics. Like, what's the left wing's plan for coming up with norms on how men and women are supposed to behave towards each other that's going to lead to a birth rate that's above replacement?
I mean, if you're talking about sexual, I don't even know that that's like a social policy thing. I mean,
well, no, but it is. It is, because we destroyed it, right?
I mean, are you talking about
social policies? We got rid of no-fault divorce. We introduced progesterone birth control without regulation. We did a number of things to encourage a new vision of sexuality, and we capstoned it with legalizing abortion.
I mean, the development of birth control is like a technological innovation, right? I mean, do you think that, like...
No, I mean, like, yeah, but I mean, like, the development of birth control was 100% ideological if you look into its actual invention. The people who pushed birth control, they didn't invent progesterone, nor did they discover that this could stop women from getting pregnant. But pushing this as a drug, by which you can incorporate it as a birth control method, that was done by people who had a very ideological reason to do that. And the fact that it wasn't immediately stopped from coming on the market as a recreational supplement, that also was a political decision.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that if you're talking about being skeptical of the left-wing social movements of the last 100 years, people aren't going to think you're talking about birth control or like porn or something, right? Or at least that's what I wasn't. I didn't realize that's what you were alluding to.
Well, what I mean, let's go through all of them if you want. Are you talking about like the racial stuff?
I mean, yeah, people are usually going to assume you're talking about like rights movements, right? Like just,
Well, I mean,
gay
even
rights.
even that is kind of like, this is, I have no desire to live in a racially diverse or a non-racially diverse. I'm entirely indifferent to this. I focus entirely on religion for the most part, although I have a culture, and obviously, I'd thrive better among people of my own culture or close to that, right? So I'm not unaware of that, but to my mind, the left wing attempt to integrate America has been a pretty big failure, in my opinion. I just do not see what we've gotten for all of the things we've done, and I bring up like affirmative action, all this stuff. Like it's just it doesn't seem to be working, I guess.
Well, I mean, again, so I mean, lots of people that would consider themselves progressives are against affirmative action for one reason or another. Like Vosh is against affirmative action, for example.
Yeah, but is that not his position? I mean, if you get rid of affirmative action, you de-diversify like our universities instantly, right?
I mean, not lots of people on the left. The goal isn't just diversity is something to be maximized in and of itself. That's not everyone's position, right? I was just telling you, if you say that you're skeptical of left-wing social movements in the last 100 years, most people are going to take that to mean that you have some sort of a problem with gay people or black people or trans people or something like that. I mean, that's where people's minds are immediately going to go.
Well, I mean, I'm against gay marriage, obviously. No, I mean, it's a ridiculous policy, in my opinion. But I don't even know what does it mean to be against gay people. What does that mean, right?
Well, I mean, being against gay marriage would be against the right of gay people.
Against,
right?
Yeah, but I mean, this idea that you have rights to institutions like this is just so far away from my understanding of how politics is run, right? And how it should be run. Certainly, the question is:
well, is the objection to gay marriage a religious objection? Because like, there's a difference between the government marriage.
It's more just conceptualizing the issue. Like why is the government forming marriage policy at all? Answer that question first.
Well, I don't think that they should necessarily.
Okay, well then why are we even talking about marriage?
I mean, I don't think that we would necessarily need to. I mean, it's
marriage policy, but the government should form marriage policy for one reason, and it should form marriage policy within ethical constraints. Right? I don't want harems or anything like that, but within ethical constraints, and ensure that we have stable families that on average hit a 2.1 children per woman when aggregated over the course of 60-year period. That's marriage. That is to my mind, that is the legitimate purpose in quantitative terms of a marriage policy. I don't see how gay marriage is pertinent to that objective. Therefore, it is sort of this irrelevant fixture of government.
Is the only objective,
and so like it's meaningless, right?
Is the only objection that gay people need to adopt so they don't affect the birth rate?
Again, you're sort of asking this question in the frame of like, I'm not stopping gay people from doing anything.
Well, I mean, the question is what is
of that objective, right? In the service of creating healthy families, I may in fact force gay people to do something if I find it pertinent. What I'm telling you is like the first thing we need to establish is our objective with government policy towards marriage. Then we decide what we're going to do, right? If the government has no policy or no preference for things that people do sexually, then why does it need to craft marriage policy at all?
Okay, well, I don't think necessarily they would. Well, let's just take a simple hypothetical just to see where your head's at.
Yeah.
So let's say that gay people exist and they're going to exist regardless of what the government does.
Okay, people can do certain things, right?
Yes. Yeah. People are going to have same-sex relationships. That's going to be a thing that happens. It's not going to go away because the government doesn't want that to happen. So let's say that the government knows that if you encourage gay people to get married, that they will have more stable family structures. They'll be able to offer better homes to adoptive children. Would you say that it was a good thing if that was the case?
I mean, I mean, I guess you're kind of hitting me with this. I don't know how much of this hypothetical to grant, and how much of it to contest.
Well, I don't know either.
You know,
That's
like,
why it's a hypothetical. I can't.
yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, you're kind of forcing me into a hypothetical. I mean, you're kind of forcing me into this strange hypothetical. Like, you know, like it's like saying, like, well, if a guy was to rape a child, would it be better if you used a condom? Yes, right. But like, why are we asking this question, right? Like, it's kind of like it's bizarre. I guess the answer is yes, right? I guess, and the regrettable.
Well, I can
in a situation where, you know,
you don't need to speculate. I can tell you what the objection is. Like, I can tell you what the point is, right?
Mhm.
I'm trying to figure out: do you actually have a legitimate problem with gay people, or is there some thing in society that you want to optimize, right? If the goal is to encourage like stable family units, I think that already kind of is the point of the government acknowledging marriage. It's like able to incentivize stable family units through tax policy.
Okay,
as far as I can tell, is really the only reason
this
to do
is
it.
like this is like progressive crime policy, right? Like, the second we did this in a progressive way, like, it all went to shit. Like, our family units are less stable than they ever have been, you know, and we can measure this for like hundreds of years. Unlike crime policy, we don't you know, crime policy, we only have like 100-year good statistics. We have a reasonable understanding that family units have never been less stable than they are right now.
Yeah, but I mean, there's probably a lot of reasons for that, right?
I think, well, there's a lot of reasons for that, but they almost all come down to technologies or policies that have been widely supported and promoted by progressives, right?
Sure. Well, I'm fine with the policies. A lot of these technologies you can smash and burn. I'd be fine with
you
that.
know, the way I think about these things, right? Obviously, as a Catholic, I believe that certain sexual acts are immoral. But I believe that a prince in charge of a country, the prince's goal in charge of a country is like he's been put in care of a garden, right? And he has to tend the garden like in a way that is to the good of that garden, and that is and so very much I feel that when we talk about politics, I have to sort of take off my Catholic hat to a certain extent. I think that the morals define what's good and bad, but I don't necessarily go. It's not definitive to say, well, this is against Catholic teaching, therefore I'm going to ban it.
Okay, so you think being gay is immoral, but implementing policy to like restrict gay people's liberty is not necessarily good policy?
I do not believe in sexual liberty, period, for gays or straights. And so the idea that we have sexual liberty is crazy to me. You don't have liberty to create life and destroy it. You don't. This is not a liberty we possess when we live in a society. There's no way that we can run a sexual marketplace in a libertine fashion and have it result in anything but a disaster. As I believe we were saying right now, I believe the state of the sexual marketplace is an absolute disaster. People are having less sex than they did like 50 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, but like,
okay, so
I guess my critique is not the individual questions aren't the problem. It's the framework of the questions exist, and that's the problem, right? I guess that's what we're sort of getting at, right?
Well, it's an odd thing to say that you don't have liberty over, because it'd be very difficult for the government to enforce any policies on it, right? I mean,
I will grant there's some things we can't enforce, sure.
I mean, are you proposing some form of monarchy? Because like it seems like this would be like
well, I might
have to be like a religious.
I don't see what that has to do with this particular question. It seems like a completely different one.
Well, I mean, if you're talking about like, you know, you don't have liberty over your own dick. I mean, like, well, okay, what's gonna have more of a domain over my dick than me? I mean, it's God or nothing. Like, if you don't believe in God, and you know who exactly has more control over my dick than I do.
But you realize that when you use your dick with another person, this creates knock-on effects for society. and they're not just contained to you. Like masturbation is a great example. Like masturbation, I have no desire to create laws against that, even though that's against the Catholic Church. Like it, but it's the knock-on effects of society that come from almost all other sexual acts. That's the issue.
Well, I mean, most of the areas in which we have liberty, there's a negative effect to the rest of the society. I mean, even something like overeating, creates a cost in the public health expenditure, which has knock-on effects for everyone. Basically, any liberty I can think of. You have the potential
you yourself proposed a limitation on the liberty of eating previously when you said that poor people should only be able to buy healthy food, right?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm not I'm not a hardcore libertarian, right? I'm just saying
I'm applying, I'm saying the logic of this is understandable, right?
Yeah, it's just that I think anything that could be phrased as a personal freedom or liberty or right, I think basically all of these things could conceivably have knock-on effects. And it's a strange thing for me to wrap my mind around if it's like you don't have the liberty to do something, but there's no mechanism of enforcing it, right? It would seem like that would have to be like a divine thing.
Well, no. Like, if there's no mechanism to enforce it, I'm not going to enforce it. So we could call that liberty, right? But when it comes to when you're saying, we need to get rid of this barrier because you have this something like
hold on. This is a good time to interrupt you because I'm just like sure. I'm more confused than what you're saying right now, I'm sure. So when you say I don't believe in sexual liberty, I don't understand exactly what you mean. Like when you say that, do you mean anything when you say that you don't have basically liberty over your own sexual practices? Do you mean anything beyond your sexual proclivities have consequences for other people? Is there something else that statement entails?
Okay, maybe I'm not understanding. I don't see how. Okay, so I guess that there is more that statement entails. So I believe that sexuality can only be legitimately used in certain. Sexuality has some teleological good that has to be recognized by society because it is humanity's chief way of reproducing itself. From that, we get to this idea that there's certain sexual acts that we can discourage or encourage with law effectively. I believe we should encourage the sexual practices that are conducive to human health and longevity of the society we want to have, and we should discourage the ones that are not. And I don't believe that a concept of sexual liberty can defeat this greater imperative to fulfill that end.
Okay, well, that makes sense.
So you can't so there's a gay bathhouse, right? So let's say that there's a bathhouse, right? Or I don't know, there's just a sports center that has a showers, right? And people shower off and they go swim or something like that, right? And then you have a gay bathhouse. And this gay bathhouse is as they were in the 70s, spreading AIDS. You couldn't be oh, wow, you can't straight to my bathhouse because, liberty or something. No, it's manifestly causing the body politic harm.
I mean, if there's a AIDS epidemic, it's a lot more it's a lot more reasonable to intervene. But just on the grounds
how about I mean, how about you could do this? You could say how about a whorehouse or something like that, right?
I mean, I I think we probably have very different ideas about that.
Okay, but I'm not trying to convince you of the particulars. I'm just trying to clue you in on the perspective.
So I understand. So I think we have different priorities.
The species is preserved through sexuality. If we capsize the birth rate, that is equivalent. that I'm worried about the body politic over 100 years. If you capsize the birth rate, that's going to hurt the body politic's health, because there's not going to be enough children born to sustain the society or to make it socially healthy.
Yeah, well, hey, that's why we have immigration.
Well, I mean, that
patches that problem right up.
Well, that's literally the agenda. I mean, that's what progressives have come up with. You think it's working well?
Yeah. I mean, I don't have any particular attachment over like, I don't think that American culture needs to stay like a certain percentage native, or however you would want to say it. I'm pretty pro immigration. But yeah, I mean, also, yeah, I think we have different priorities.
So is America just, we're constantly going to be ducking below 2.1, and just will the entire world be like this? Is everywhere going to go below 2.1? Who's going to import from where then?
I mean, I don't know exactly. I mean,
if every country is below 2.1, then nobody can import immigrants.
I mean, I don't see an overall decline in population as necessarily being a bad thing. I mean, I wouldn't know exactly what the consequences of that would be, but it's not like, I mean, there's 8 billion people on the planet. I don't think we necessarily need 9 billion, right?
The consequence of low of sub 2.1 birth rates is your society slowly dies and has to be fed from another society that's having higher birth rates. So if you consistently preserve 2.1 birth rates, eventually you'll hit zero population. If you go below that.
Well, I mean, that's assuming the trend line never changes. I mean,
yes.
Presumably at some point, like something would happen, right? And this is obviously going to happen over a very long period of time. If you had a 1.9, like I do the math, but I'm guessing it would take hundreds, probably thousands of years to see a dramatic, like to get anywhere near that. And I'm pretty sure something would happen.
I mean, through immigration and low birth rates, we've seen a dramatic swing in demographics inside Western countries, to the extent that few people thought was impossible.
Sure. And I mean, I'm happy to concede that there are a non-zero number of problems that arises. I just think that overall it seems to be like fine. I also don't mind prioritizing birth rates as a political thing that you care about. It's not like I think that's intrinsically bad or something. It's just, I guess it's not what I care about personally.
I guess, I mean, I don't see what leads you to believe that this is such a good way of doing things, I guess. As opposed to, like, in the 50s, we had, or in the 50s and early 60s, we had, this country grew through birth rates and was stable in birth rates. And now we're massively unstable and just importing new populations constantly to make up for the decline in citizens that we couldn't get by having children. And I mean, I see a much less healthy society.
I mean, I don't see an intrinsic problem with either a shrinking population or an increasingly diverse population, unless there's a demonstrable harm.
You see a problem with fewer families?
I mean, no. I mean, do you mean less stable family units? There's a problem with less stable family units.
Less stable family units, but also fewer family units forming, such that people are just like permanently single, never marry.
Yeah. I mean, I'm probably a bit more culturally conservative than most progressives in that respect. I'm like pretty strictly monogamous. And I'm pretty
you don't think that these effects are all? I mean, to me, these effects are all highly correlated.
I mean, aren't immigrants like more monogamous and stable in their family units than?
Yeah, I went over this. They are, and then due to our culture, they become less.
Hey,
over the course of generations.
Look, it's.
I don't know. Like, if this were a population of, like,
look,
this idea.
Okay,
this idea
Dave,
that you
Dave.
feed, yeah.
Look,
no,
it's
no,
like, look,
listen to this.
Let me explain. Okay,
No,
it's like homeopathy. We just need to drown all the white people and immigrants, okay, until it's one part per million. Okay,
No, but like,
and then we'll all be stable family units again.
But you're taking a system that doesn't sustain itself. It would be one thing if it was like a one-time thing where, like, in this generation, the native populations of England don't have enough to make it up, and then you move in like a few million Indians, and then like the problem's fixed, and now all of a sudden everyone, like, the population's stable. But like that's not what you're doing. You're moving in the new people, and then they
every once in a while
bombing out, and then you move in new people, and then they bomb out. Like the system is not itself stable. Like the units don't reproduce themselves. You constantly have to feed the system in order to get stable results.
Okay, here's what we do to have a stable system. Okay, so we have America with our enormous walls, right? And then every 5 years we just bomb the shit out of some country, and then they'll have to increase their birth rates, because we'll completely destabilize their economy, and then we'll just restore their economy and import all their immigrants. And then every 5 years, we'll a different country. Yeah, it's fucking perfect. What's wrong with that?
Good Lord. I mean, devastate the third world so that they have out of control birth rates, so that we can destroy our own populations and move the third world into the first world.
Yeah, to be clear, I'm joking.
Well, I mean, you're joking, but I mean, that kind of is the policy. It only works with a devastated third world because the system is not like, it's never stable. It's not like there's a certain number of people from the third world you can bring in, and then all of a sudden, we're good. Like constantly have to move in new people.
What is the intrinsic problem in having a population decline? I mean, assuming that it's a slight population decline and not a severe one.
What we've experienced in terms of demographic shift is not slight by any historical measure. This has been a historically massive shift.
Sure, but that's not the question. The question is, let's imagine that instead we live in Japan, or it's like basically an ethno state, right? It's like you have one homogenous culture or whatever the fuck. I don't know exactly what percent. I think it's like 97% or something in Japan.
If we were hermetically sealed, or if we were doing this in a controlled fashion, right, like with a very steady number of immigrants, right, and you could dip below 2.1 and keep it there. Granted, you do the mechanisms to bring it back up. Very few countries have been as easily able to increase their birth rate as they have been able to decrease it. See China or Japan. Like, sure, but when they tried to decrease their population birth rate, and they were able to do so like that in a snap. But bringing it back up has been like fucking moving a boulder up a hill.
I mean, I'm not going to contest that. That seems to make a lot of sense to me. But what I'm asking is,
if you move it down below 2.1, you're doing something intrinsically dangerous.
But I'm asking you, why is it
into a decline, and you don't well understand the mechanism from it? It's like taking a plane and putting it into a dip, and you're not so sure that the mechanism to pull yourself out of that dip is even working. Like, I think I'm right to be concerned about this, right?
Well, that's what I'm asking you is why. That's why I brought up the Japan example. So you have a culturally homogenous society. Let's say you have a 1.9 birth rate. Why would that be intrinsically bad for Japan?
A 1.9 birth rate in an isolated situation is not intrinsically bad for Japan. This is the if, big if they know how to bring that 1.9 and back up to 2.1 when they're done decreasing their population. That is an enormous if, because if they cannot do that, their society will die.
I mean, over a very long time scale, right?
Longer than you might think. They're taking a 10% cut every generation. And they're getting older every generation too.
I mean, it's a 5% cut, but yeah.
Okay, we're quibbling, right? I mean, like these. If there's nothing like, I don't know.
Well, I'm just, again, just to be clear, I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm just trying to understand the point of view, because it doesn't make sense to me why it's intrinsically a bad thing, unless it persists over a very long period of time. And I don't understand why you would assume that it would have to.
But I mean, I'm not saying that nobody's figured out how to raise birth rates. We have seen a number of small examples where they have been able to raise the birth rate above 2.1. Like that's happened. But it's not easy to do. And once you're in a situation where you just have to import people, because otherwise your economy is going to go under. You're in a very bad position.
Maybe.
I guess I don't understand why this isn't like, if we were talking about a colony of ants, this would be so easy to see, right? Like if we were talking about a colony of animals, and you're like, I want this colony of animals to live for 200 years, and like, you know, your fellow scientist goes up like, well, your females aren't producing children. You're like, oh well, who cares?
I mean,
like, you would never do that, right? You would never, like, a farmer would never think that it was like a minor thing if his herds just stopped having children. That would be like a huge red flag.
Well, it would. I mean, it depends on ecology, right? In the abstract, what you're saying makes perfect sense. But I mean, again, we could imagine a scenario where an environment is only able to support a certain number of animals, and decline in population might lead to, you know, better overall health and longevity for the animals that are there, just because there aren't enough resources to support a high population. I'm not saying that like
that's whole true. Meme, if we were staring down if the Western countries were just staring down like a massive overpopulation, that would be one thing. But we're manifestly not.
Yeah,
as a matter of fact, our countries are getting more crowded purely out of immigration.
I mean, we aren't overcrowded here. There are places that are overcrowded.
Well, I'm saying, like, but the premise, it gets to this. I guess this is sort of my issue dealing with this leftist thing. I don't see a coherent way of balancing this. Is the issue, right? Like when we talk about immigration, and when we talk about birth generally, like when we talk about the utility of having children, suddenly countries are just horribly crowded, and we're so crowded that like any more children will decrease the health and longevity of the population as a whole. When we talk about immigrants, it's just like, oh wow, you know, like we don't have enough people here. The more the merrier. Like let's have, you know, let's be like Matthew Iglesias and try to get 1 billion Americans into this country. You know, like the narrative just it's never consistent. I don't like for myself. It's just, I ask myself the question of what would proper stewardship be over a community I cared about persisting. And, you know, a patch using immigration is something that I can accept. A gaping hole that needs to be filled again and again and again is something I can't.
I mean, from most lefties' perspective, first of all, they aren't going to give a shit about birth rates. They would find this entire conversation to be quite weird. But beyond that, there wouldn't be a distinction drawn between immigrants and native citizens. So, like, I mean, that would be their perspective. I mean, that's basically my perspective.
Their perspective are all humans are interchangeable.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is, I don't know how consistent this is, right? Like, if we, you know, if we flooded a Native American reservation with, you know, white people, and to the point where their culture was completely obliterated, I think a lot of lefties would notice that and would complain about that. You don't think they would?
I mean, they would. It's just, it's a funny
visual. They would. We all know they would, right?
Hey, look, I support raising the. I can't even make that joke. I'm gonna get canceled.
But I guess, you know, these principles that supposedly undergird the left, I don't think they're really principles, I guess, right?
I mean, I would say the same thing about most people.
Someone in the chat saying we did overrun the Native Americans and push their culture into into the margins. I totally agree with you, and that was a shit thing we did, right? Like that didn't work out well. Are people in agreement about that? I thought we were in agreement about. Like, that's the one thing that I thought righties and lefties could kind of like agree on.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that a lot of people on the left espouse values they don't actually hold, but I think the same thing is true of basically everyone. I don't think that's a uniquely left thing. It's more frustrating for me because I have to deal with lefties. I don't get, I don't have fucking Nazis in my DMs annoying the fuck out of me. So I'm generally speaking a lot more annoyed with communists. But It's not like I don't think your average person on the right is like super ideologically consistent either. Just most people don't think through their ideas.
Well, I have the advantage of having a community of people who does kind of like thinking through these things, it's just I'm really overdue for super chats, but on the whole sex thing, which is how we started with this whole thing. I think the perspectives are just so different, right? Because like my morality, like I have two more. I don't have just one moral source. I'm using two. The first one's Catholicism, and the second one is just like, how would I, as a Machiavellian prince, be a good steward to this population of people, such that their posterity would thrive and grow in health. And neither of those two principles get me to sexual liberty. To me, sexual liberty just isn't. It impedes that. For me, you can't have liberty without answering liberty for what. And I don't think that we can run a sexual free marketplace. It doesn't work. For my purposes at least.
I mean, from my point of view, I don't see a practical way to really restrict it. So, there's an element of what you're saying where I can understand, but I just don't see how there's any practical means to restrict these things. A lot of the restrictions would seem to be pretty fucking unethical, from my perspective, even if the long-term outcomes.
I'm sure there's no ethical way to restrict them from your perspective. I will grant that. I don't think I necessarily consider some of these things unethical. I mean, would you grant that we restricted them in the past?
I mean, are we talking about like restricting gay people from getting married?
Well, I know you're focused on the.
I'm just confused.
I'm actually thinking more about straight people, to be honest. I don't really care one way or the other about what gay people do.
I don't think that a lot of the changes have necessarily come from policy. I think the changes come from like the technology of like dating apps and the proliferation of, like culture. I don't think it really comes from like a political policy is really what has changed the family unit from the 1950s to now. I don't know if you disagree with that.
It's technology. It's both, right?
Yeah. Like low key, if you're talking about like making fucking dating apps illegal, like on a consistent level, I'm opposed to that, but it sounds kind of based. I just think
that's actually,
but they are cancer,
right? Like say OnlyFans, right? OnlyFans is just a total cancer on our society. So just let's take a right-wing organization like, I don't know, something like Patriotic Alternative from the UK, right? So they're technically legal, but the government does everything to ban them off every single social media, like to pull their funding. It cancels their bank accounts.
Is it like Nick Fuentes?
What?
What is that? Like patriotical? I don't even know what that is.
It's a nationalist party from Britain,
okay.
Right? And like the government has encouraged bank accounts to shut down their accounts. They're banned off of every social media imaginable. Their best way to promote themselves is through flyers. If you did that to OnlyFans, you think they'd be in business for like a day? Like, okay, you're banned from every single like.
Well, no,
OnlyFans, Amazon can't host your services anymore.
Well, this
Neither
experiment,
can Google, and Google results won't pull you up. Furthermore, guess what? No major bank is going to carry your accounts, and your credit line's zero.
Well, the experiment's already been run.
I hope you can pay off your investors. I'll see you in chapter 11, right? Like that will be it, right? That will be it, the end of OnlyFans.
Well, the experiment's already been run. They thought their payment processes were going to get disrupted, and they like announced that they were going to prohibit adult content. So, obviously, in an empirical sense, that's what would happen. But I don't think
proves that like this isn't like this is a policy, right? Like we could.
Well, you could, but I don't. This is probably going to be a substantial area of disagreement. I don't think that OnlyFans or porn are like a major contributor to like the decline of the family unit. But I've talked with people on the right.
The decline of. Well, what do you think is the reason why nobody is like substantially fewer people are getting married or even having sexual experiences anymore? Why do you think that's occurring since like the internet age?
I mean, I think there's two things. One is that financially, it's a lot more difficult for people that are younger to really, start a life. If you want to start a family, it's a somewhat expensive thing, and a lot of people just straight up can't afford it. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can measure that, but I think that's a major contributing factor. Another is that um, there's a kind of decision fatigue that happens where when people think they have infinite alternatives, it's very difficult to make a permanent choice. So it's the
why do
kind of
they think
thing.
they have infinite alternatives?
Well, because they kind of do, and like the difference between.
Let's be specific about this, right? Like,
So the distinction.
why does the person in 2010 think he has infinite alternatives, but the person in 1990 not?
So the distinction is as you go back in time, like the opportunities for traveling and meeting other people have vastly expanded. I mean, particularly through the internet. So through the internet,
like no, but now we just circle back, and you're telling me that your point was that it wasn't the internet doing this.
No, I think it is. I'm pretty sure I would have said that it was because I think that's a major contributing factor. Is like the fucking.
You said that pornography and dating apps.
I said pornography and OnlyFans. I don't see the connection with pornography and OnlyFans. Dating apps, obviously. Dating apps are the main reason that people don't like. It's very easy for people to conceive of this like mythical person that they're going to meet, and because of this person, they like hesitate to settle down, or they're less inclined to overlook a problem their partner might have because they can conceive of some hypothetical partner that doesn't have that problem. And when people are in unstable relationships, they're a lot more likely to end those relationships because they know they have options. I mean, like the access to dating websites and the proliferation of like basically online dating, I think is the most obvious contributing factor to why people would take longer to form a family unit.
Well, I to be honest, this might be just me mishearing you, but also some of it's psychological because I see kind of pornography and high-speed dating apps and OnlyFans is kind of on a continuum. And I think they all need to be heavily curtailed.
Yeah, I mean, this is a conversation I've had with people on the right a lot, and I think I've heard all the arguments. I just don't find them very convincing. I just don't think porn is that big of a deal. Like, for most people,
I'm not. It seems like you're partially granting my point. You're just. I mean, I don't know. I don't. I feel like we agree that it's some combination of dating apps and.
Well, I mean, we probably
sexual services that are doing this, right?
Okay, we probably agree on dating apps. Like, I think dating apps are basically cancer, and like, I don't think there's any ethical way to restrict them, really. But I would be happier if they just fucking disappeared. Like, that is basically my position. And like, right now, I'm not dating, but when I start again, I'm not going to use them. I'm just not going to. We'll find some other way to meet people. So I hate them.
I'm one to talk because I literally met my wife on a dating app, right? So it was a dating app geared towards marriage, granted.
Yeah, and like I've even been somewhat successful on dating apps. It's just I just don't like. I find the process to be really dehumanizing and unpleasant. And yeah, I don't know. I really dislike them.
I say for for the OnlyFans thing. For every guy that's struggling with sort of like the paralysis of choice, that the sort of more, I can tell that you're more on my sort of socio-economic level. But if you go down a few rungs on the ladder, I talked to Stardust a few days ago, and he's very focused on men who might not be doing as well as us. Those guys are a lot of those guys. I'm not saying Stardust's audience. I'm just saying a lot of guys in that position. They're just totally mesmerized by these cam girls, and they've organized their life around these fictions.
What? Yeah. So I'm in a weird position. On the one hand, I have dated some like preposterously attractive people, but I also don't think that it really matters that much. To put it in crude terms, if a woman is attractive, I don't think her being ridiculously attractive really adds all that much. And I know this isn't a particularly popular take. A lot of people don't feel that way. So if someone did feel that like physical attractiveness was the vast majority of what they cared about in a woman, then I can easily see how porn would completely fuck them up. It's just hard for me to relate to that because I just don't feel that way. Like I could just like it would be very easy for me to like watch porn of the most idealized person every day and then date someone considerably less attractive than the average person on a porn website and then never look at porn again. And just, I wouldn't like it would be easy for me. So it's very
Are we
difficult for
talking
me
about for you or for like
for me. So
men
it's
generally?
for me. So it's difficult for me to conceive of porn as being
Sure.
this like society destroying force. It's like, well, why, why is it particularly important? Like, why would you
Well, I mean,
care that?
to be honest, I don't exactly know the breakdown, right? Like all I know is that I have this. I want people to form families. I want people to form communities, and I want people to continue on in society. You know, I'm not particular about it. I'm not a stickler for particular in this mode. I'm not, right. I obviously have preferences that are more specific pertaining to religious beliefs, but I'm looking for the cause of a collapse of something I care about. And, you know, we've got three culprits here that obviously were involved in some ways in this collapse and need to be confronted if this is going to be fixed in any way. And, you know, I guess if you're talking about like thinking about how to fix this, like it just, I guess I just can't get past this.
Get past what particular?
No, I mean, so like I'm saying, how are people going to start marrying and forming families again? That's the question I'm asking. And
I mean, the easiest fix that I would think would be some effort to fix the economic situation, make housing more affordable, make, generally speaking, starting a family more affordable. I think that would go a long way. You could use, I mean, you could use the hammer of the government to incentivize people through tax credits or whatever the fuck. I mean, I don't know.
Well, you've happened to hit upon one of the, not one of the few. I have many areas of left-wing belief in economic policy, but decreasing housing value is definitely one of them. And I think we could do all making jobs
based, comrade. Let's steal the houses from the rich people and give them the based. Excellent.
If you want to do it in a non-cringe communist way, the most important thing is to build jobs in areas where it's cheaper to build houses. The big problem we're dealing with right now is that, I mean, or you want to massively change the building codes in the cities where all the jobs exist, because that's the main issue. I'm just talking as a California native. Like all the jobs are on this little corridor around the Bay, and trying to get housing there is absolutely insane. And
yeah, I have a friend that lives in San Francisco that makes like $300K a year, and that's a lot less than you would expect given his fucking housing costs and shit.
And like, who can raise children there, right? Like nobody.
I mean, he can, but people.
Well, yeah, 300,000, sure. Well, actually, I don't know. I mean, given that's actually an open question, given how absolutely atrocious the costs are in that dimension.
His wife also makes 200K, so they're fine.
Okay, well, now you're getting into the area where they're just rich, right?
Yeah, they're doing okay. But
well,
I mean, point being, it costs a lot of fucking money to live there.
I mean,
ideally, at one point,
people could live in, you don't all have to live in San Francisco. You hypothetically, you could make hubs for jobs in other towns like we did in the early 20th century. I mean,
we've learned through COVID that the vast majority of jobs can be done from home. So, I mean, there's some hope there. I think there's going to be a lot more like a lot less of a direct tying from work to having to live in a particular place, because I mean that is basically the root of the problem, is that jobs are concentrated in these places, so the housing costs rise, and eventually the housing costs just get completely absurd. And that's basically what's happened in a lot of the places where all the best jobs are. Housing costs wouldn't be a problem if you could buy a house in Illinois. I mean, there's houses near where I live that cost $50,000 and you can get a perfectly decent house.
Yeah, I went to school briefly in Michigan, and there was a house that sold for $15.
Yeah,
I'm serious.
Well, that's probably a piece of shit.
Oh, it was, but you're getting a foundation in a house-sized lot for $15 in a metropolitan area that used to be a hub for people's jobs.
Yeah,
If you took that house and went back to the 70s, that would be like a middle-class house.
Yeah, I mean, I would buy a house in Michigan for $15. Seems like a very good deal.
Yeah, I mean, there like someone's bringing up that there's like hidden costs, and I get it, right? But like, I'm just trying to illustrate the fact that it's all about location and the fact that we built our entire economy around centralizing on a few metropolitan areas. So at this point, I just have to do the super chats. Do you want to stay on? And you can if you want and answer them
sure.
if you like.
I was actually gonna remind you about that.
It's late here, and I'm bad. I got really involved in that conversation about, I think before I did super chats, like the sex thing, right? It's just, you can't divorce the question from just what our priorities are, right? And without the natalist priorities, my worldview just does not make any sense. My entire worldview is organized around encouraging people to make families. So once you start going like, okay, well, what if families aren't a good thing? Then obviously none of my ideas are going to be at all rational, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So Society Man for $5 USA. This is on the first stream. Society Man was good enough to give me a super chat, so I wasn't just sitting there rambling. Dave, did you see the Communist Party of Canada officially denounced the trucker convoy as anti-worker? Well, I guess I'm not surprised by that, because I know that the Communist Party is and never has been a workers' movement. It is a movement of people from the intellectual class and disaffected people from the intellectual classes who co-opt workers' movements when it benefits them. And I don't think that this truckers convoy benefits the intellectual class. Do you have any thoughts on the truckers convoy or communists' coldness towards them, Doomer?
Not much. I mean, I don't know. I think it's interesting that like the left wing claims to be pro-worker, and it seems to be against like a lot of worker-run strikes and stuff. That's kind of an interesting angle. But overall, I am overall incredibly bored by the conversations about COVID. Like from the beginning, I really haven't given a shit, and having to deal with it for years, I'm just like, just whatever, dude. I just don't want to hear about it anymore.
Well, do you feel that this is going to be the beginning of a digital idea or a social credit system, like in China?
Probably
like,
not.
For instance, I had to show medical history records to buy a hamburger in Canada. Like, I had to literally show them my medical records to buy.
Yeah, but the social credit system is like this whole fucking big thing, right? I mean, checking for vaccines, I understand why people on the right think it's incredibly cringe, but it's a far cry. It's like a far cry from like, if you're friends with the wrong person, like we're not going to let you buy a house, which is basically what the social credit system is.
Well, I mean, did you hear this thing about Michelle Malkin the other day? Like the what is Airbnb banned her from, because of her politics, they banned her from ever using their site to contract with other third parties to rent houses for vacation. And to make sure she didn't use it, they also banned her husband in anticipation that he would buy it for her. Presumably, they'll have to ban her daughter and her aunt and uncle and grandparents too to prevent this from occurring.
Right? Who is Michelle Malkin?
She is I think she's a conservative. I don't know. She kind of straddles the line between conservative, like normie conservatives and paleo conservatives or nationalists. She's I think she's Filipina or something. Her husband's white.
Well, I don't know.
She's one of these like strange people who's not white but always gets accused of being a white nationalist. Strangely enough.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I think the idea of like the social credit system is pretty overblown, but I mean, I understand the
I mean, to
hesitancy
me, that
people have about
sounds like the
reporting
beginning
medical
of it,
records and
right?
stuff. I mean, I don't think so. I mean, it's like if the fucking virus went away, I think this would go away. And if the like basically the concern would need to be that this is going to be this thing that takes on a life of its own and gets worse. I don't think that's the case. I think the vaccine mandate stuff is like a response to a public health crisis that ideally will fucking go away at some point, and we'll be able to go back to normal. And so yeah.
Again, I've been saying that for 2 years and it hasn't happened.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully at some point. Hopefully.
I mean, I guess I was very much like you at one point in my life, Doomer. I was very much of the opinion that things had sort of safety rails around them, and they couldn't get absolutely insane because sober heads would sort of prevail. But now I pretty much assume that if they take one step in a direction, they're going to be taking the next one pretty soon. If they ban Michelle Malkin from OnlyFans, eventually they're going to be banning people like me from OnlyFans if they can figure out who I am.
I mean,
no, it's OnlyFans. But I say,
yeah. Airbnb.
Why would I even want to use OnlyFans? I want to ban it.
That was a good meme though. Someone clipped Dave saying they're going to ban him from OnlyFans.
Someone's going to totally clip me on that. Oh my god, this is why I don't stream when it's super late, because I'm literally losing my my cognitive ability when I if people are going to ban Michelle Malkin from Airbnb, they're eventually going to ban me from Airbnb.
Look, as a proud leftist, I think Michelle Malkin should be allowed on OnlyFans. I'd love to see that.
Well, yeah, I mean that joke of Michelle Malkin on in that's been a well-worn joke since the early 2000s. Her in various lewd capacities has been a well-worn. Chat's going nuts over that over that slip. Okay, let's keep on going. Otherwise, I'm never going to get to the end of these things. Okay, the 21st century reaction for $3 USA says their civil rights power formula is getting stale, but there's plenty of steam in the sodomy narrative. I don't understand the sodomy narrative. Perhaps progressive history will go from New Deal classism to civil rights to the sodomy state. Well, I don't know what he means by sodomy narrative, but I think he just means like the LGBTQ stuff. Although it does remind me of Glee being described as a symphony of self-congratulatory sodomy, the TV show Glee from the 2000s. That was my favorite description of it, was a symphony of self-congratulatory sodomy. But now I guess the comment here, the serious comment, is that really identity politics is king on the left and not economics. And I think this is sort of what we're realizing now, is that it doesn't matter anything to do with workers. It just matters what side you're on in the greater culture, where it seems.
Yeah.
And I know that Thinking Ape was giving me crap in the chat for my ideas about banning things like OnlyFans being pie in the sky. I don't think anyone's going to ban OnlyFans. I think that what's going to happen is people are going to create parallel societies, and they're going to stigmatize this stuff, and that's going to be the way forward. And the story of society will be the story of the few communities that actually are still having children, which will be very few and far between in the West after the changes that are coming up. Aristocratic Owl for $3. If one of the re-uploaded videos of Fran Games Radio, he predicts that the Democratic Party will centralize into a one-party state by 2024 due to demographics. Do you guys agree? So this is an interesting question. Do you think that because of immigration and demographics, the Democrats will just be able to freeze the Republicans out on a more or less permanent basis, and that all positions of importance will essentially be just Democratic positions, Doomer?
No, that seems very unrealistic. I mean,
Well, it happened in the
honestly,
university, so it's not out of the question, right?
no. But the problem is that like in order to even move vaguely in that direction, the Democrats would need to take some positions that they're just never going to take, from what I can tell. Um, I mean,
Mm.
the Republican Party, generally speaking, is it's able to out influence its relative position in government sometimes. So even if
I don't see that. I see that it underestimates its electoral victories. It under influences relative to its electoral victories.
I mean, well, the electoral system, generally speaking, benefits it. So,
Yes,
like,
in the sense that there's geographic diversity requirements.
yeah, I mean, and like just like the electoral college and stuff like that. But I mean, if anything, I I see in the short term Republicans gaining. I mean, the idea of Democrats coalescing a one party state in 2024 just seems like way off in left field, like bizarre to me. It seems much more likely that the Republicans would just like win, right? Like if Trump is the nominee, Trump could legitimately just win. Um, and it seems recently the Republicans have been better at sniping off independents and Democrats than Democrats have been at sniping off independents and Republicans. Um, so I don't know. I think that there's a lot of people that are very, very crystallized in their defense of each of the respective factions. So I just don't see anything. I don't see any serious change coming to the two party system really as we perceive it in the near future. And if
I feel
anything,
like this is, I think, a persistent theme in this talk is you think things are kind of keep on, well, COVID possibly withstanding. You think that things are going to kind of keep on going the way they have been, and I have this creeping suspicion that things are going to be changing quite significantly in short order, or there's going to be some kind of turn.
I mean, I could see changes. It's just like the two party system in America is like a preposterously difficult thing to change, and like the apparatus of Democrats, I don't know. Maybe you guys see it as being more powerful than I see it as being, but
I mean, to go to three, it's hard to get rid of, but to go to one, maybe not, right?
I just I don't see how that happens. I mean, like, can you
I
explain
don't know. I
how it
mean,
would happen?
yeah, easy. I mean, like Texas turns blue, and another state. I don't know what the electoral map looks like, but you could easily imagine states like maybe North Carolina turning blue, and a few other ones because of demographics. And then basically, you have an electoral map that's unwinnable by the Republican Party, and the Democrats just consolidate. They consolidate a stranglehold on the federal government.
Um, I mean, the last time that we saw like a serious landslide that would look like a world ending for one of the parties, it was like Reagan's election, right? I think he won one of his elections like he won like almost every state. It was like
Yeah,
a
but
fucking
that's yes,
preposterous landslide.
but
I mean,
in the 70s and 80s, I believe this is the case. I don't have statistics to back this up. I believe that people were less partisanly stuck. What you see these days is like party affiliation being highly linked to demographic affiliation and class affiliation.
that is true. The difference is that people are often not mobilized to vote when they're unhappy with whatever their party did. So like, okay, so like let's say there's a nightmare scenario, right? Let's say that in 2024, the Democrats take 350 electoral votes, which is a fucking lot. It's a very very it, it, wait, did I fuck this up? No, yeah. So let's say they get a pretty substantial landslide. Um, Even if that were the case, even if they get a pretty substantial landslide, if they govern in a way that people aren't happy with, then the Republican Party will find some angle. They'll find some grievance to motivate people, and the Democratic base will be suppressed. and the Republican base will surge in some way.
Okay.
And at the very least, they'll be able to eke out victory.
But here, let me bring up a counterexample. My native state, California. I go back there periodically, like every year. I used to live there. I mean, I periodically lived there. You go talk to Californians about the government, they all hate their government. But their government's going to be permanently Democratic, I guarantee you that.
I mean, wasn't Schwarzenegger a Republican governor recently? I don't pay any attention to what happens in
Schwarzenegger was a Republican that governed as a Democrat.
Okay.
But like there isn't the state used to be like a state that like Reagan was governor there.
Yeah.
I mean, this is, and that whole GOP is gone. The GOP now exists basically as a home for, celebrity politicians that are just, going to be a little less democratic, but still part of the same circle of people.
Yeah, I mean,
it's just there's just no opposition political force in that state.
Well, at the state level, I mean, that the premise is much more believable. I mean, there are areas where I can't really conceive of one party really contesting the other.
So people are just asking if that could manifest on the nation scale. I don't see what the big barrier is. I guess it could easily just not happen, right?
I mean, well, okay, so there's two separate questions. One is like, could you have a massive landslide in one direction or the other? I think that's totally possible. But would it be sustained over time such that like one of the parties stops being a thing? I just find that the only way that, okay, here's my perspective. The only way that you would be able to have a massive landslide and then sustain it is if basically one party was able to have a landslide out of whatever reason and then actually govern in a way that made people happy. And I just, that has not happened anytime recently. I mean, the only time maybe in the last 20 years that we've had a sustained period of people really liking the president was Bush after 9/11. And that didn't really have much to do with Bush necessarily. It just was a sense of national unity coming behind to rally together after a national tragedy. I mean, the American public seems to be way too resistant to the government to coalesce around like a one-party state. I mean, it would imply that you're happy with your government, which I just don't see happening.
I don't know. I didn't see. I mean, this whole COVID thing demonstrates to me that the American people are very willing to go along with pretty much anything.
Maybe. I don't know.
I mean, I would have never predicted that this would have happened. But let's keep on going. Okay, so now we're on to Iron Duke 99. Thank you for moderating, Iron Duke. I saw you get rid of those bots from my chat. I appreciate it. Dave, please ask the organizers of the U.S. event from Skildings, I think that's the event I'll be attending, to unban Don the Pleb. They look pathetic banning him for something he didn't do. Yeah, so I did kind of tentatively voice a slight objection to this. This is just sort of an emergent drama, so I'm not going to harp on this. Iron Duke, I'll just tell you that your message is heard, and I will try to voice my objection more forcefully to see if I can't resolve this drama. I really, 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 really hate drama. I hope I wasn't too contentious in this discussion, Doomer, but you should know that I just really hate online drama and like dogpiling and stuff like that. And everyone loves it, right?
Yeah, I enjoy it for the most part, even when it's directed at me sometimes. But
you were the victim of it about 2 weeks ago, right? So
yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't. Well, the thing is, I have a pretty simple policy. I don't really go after people without a really, really good reason. But if someone puts me on the defense, I'm all about it. It's like, okay, if you're gonna fucking talk shit, I'll fucking defend myself, right? But as long as people aren't attacking me, I don't know. I think I'm a pretty reasonable and pleasant person to talk to for the most part.
Yeah, I think we had a great discussion. I think that our moral axioms are just too far apart to really get into the meat of it. I don't think I really disagreed with you on gay marriage so much as just the perspective you had was just so different from mine in terms of where you started.
Yeah.
The question, it wasn't that you were asking me questions that I disagree with. The questions just weren't, they didn't seem properly posed, in my opinion, right? And I think that's the difference, is that our moral priorities our priorities are too far apart. Okay, but thank you very much, Iron Duke. I will voice that objection again as best I can. Nerve AMV Maker, you have token lefties that talk about, for $10. Thank you very much, Nerve AMV Maker. You have token lefties that talk about workers and class struggle, such as secular talk. These guys are kept around so that if identity politic narrative ever seriously loses credibility, they can pivot back to workers' rights, like figures who are only marginally discredited by the identity politics movement. Well, that would be right. I mean, do you think there's a serious danger? I don't know much about secular talk, but you think there's a serious danger that the left will lose its sort of workers' rights credibility by doing things like denouncing the trucker convoy and stuff like that?
I mean, they already kind of have in a lot of ways. I mean, I think if you were to talk to working class people about who had their best interest, you would get a really split answer. Like, I don't think there is a. I don't think there. A lot of lefties might imagine that it's obvious that the left wing is the voice of the working class, but I don't really think that that's the case. So, I mean, I guess I'm more doomer on this one. I just think we've kind of already crossed that threshold. Again, lefties like to pretend like, oh, we love the working class, we love the poor, blah blah blah, but and then in the next breath they'll talk about, oh, these morons vote against their own self-interest and elect Republicans that just want to take all their money or whatever the fuck they say. So I think it's mostly I don't think that I don't think that working class people are united in seeing the left as working in their best interest.
I think what people are wondering is if the right will be ever the working class party.
I mean, potentially, if I could easily see that happening.
Oh, we got 3 more super chats. Okay, let's go really quickly. Aristocratic Owl for $3. Hey, Dave, if you were the sovereign of a blue state, how would you try governing liberals as full human beings? If I were sovereign of a blue state? Well, I mean, see, if I was sovereign, I would just completely reconstruct the institutions so that they would reflect what I consider to be pro-human policies. I doubt that the sort of the white progressives would survive as an elite class if I were sovereign. I would just, like, for instance, if you just okay, we're just ganking Harvard's endowments and building a new university. Good luck, guys. We're gonna buy out all your astrophysicists and put them in this new university that doesn't have any of the ideological trappings of the old one. Maybe we'll even buy your buildings. The elite class wouldn't survive that mix-up. They would just die, and then a new elite class would come. And this is the thing, like, elite classes think that they're so secure until they're suddenly not. And white progressives really, really, really think that they're just going to rule this country forever, and that their priorities and their value system is just going to rule forever. And I don't think it will. I think when I say governing people as human beings, what I genuinely really respect about leftists, and I know I'm going on a little bit of a tangent right here, is that if you're a leftist and you want to build your anarchist utopia or your communist utopia or your diverse multicultural utopia, I am for that 100%. If Vosh anteed up and built the society he wanted to live in, my opinion of him would in 24 hours completely flip 180 degrees. And I think that I would treat progressives as moral human beings by giving them the opportunity for autonomy. And if they want to live their principles as religious dissidents, there's nothing I respect more than religious dissidents who want to ante up and put their money where their mouth is. And I think that I would grant them the ability to do that. I don't think that there is actually I don't think there's a genuine desire to build anything like that, because there's no power in it. And I guess fair enough, but that's a different thing entirely. That, in my mind, is not a genuine religious belief. Iron Duke 99 for $3 says, I don't want to lock up gays for private sex, but that has nothing to do with actual marriage. I think this is on the gay marriage question, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I might agree with that. I think. Yeah, I don't understand why, we even have marriage if there's not some priority we have to encourage families. And if we don't have a priority to encourage families, we should just privatize marriage.
I mean, I wouldn't. I don't know that I would necessarily be opposed to the government stepping out of the marriage business, but if we're going to be in the marriage business, I think that gay people should be in the marriage business as well.
Should polygamous people?
Sure, as cringe as they are.
Yeah, I mean, once that happens, it's just, it doesn't mean anything then, right? I was just like, okay, you have a relation. I mean, it's so weird. So at that point, the whole idea of government sanctioned,
well, it would be
relationships is so bizarre, right?
Well, the polygamous thing opens up a lot of cans of worms, but presumably, well, I mean, there's a lot of different conceivable relationship structures, right? But if you were to imagine, for example, let's say two people are always dating each other, but they fuck other people. I mean, if they got the same protections from the government that a normal married couple got, they would still be encouraged to be stable and stay together. They would just also be fucking other people. I mean, it's conceivable to me that you could still have government incentives make relationships more stable, even if they're polygamous. Even though I'm not the biggest fan of polygamy, but it still seems like I could still conceive of basically the exact same protections being optimal.
Yeah, I think we're just doing something that's fundamental. Like the way it's just, again, it's like the whole global warming thing. It's not the facts that are the issue. It's just the way that we're approaching this question, to me, is just so bizarre. It's the framework that I have to answer this in. To me, if you don't have a teleology of what's right or wrong about sex, then why are you making policy about it? And marriage policy is just that. And if you don't have an interest in creating human families, why are you privileging some? I can't make the framework make sense. Nirvan V Maker for $3 USA talks about Republican being or not permanently displaced, ignores the fact that most Republicans will have to move more left wing to stay relevant. The Republicans today are more left wing than 90s Democrats. Do you agree with that? The Republicans today are more left wing than 90s Democrats?
I mean, in some ways, probably, but overall, I don't know. I mean, I've seen some visualizations of this, and they seem to suggest the opposite, that basically both parties are kind of drifting off into extremes.
Yeah, but I mean, I can't think of a policy that, for instance, gay marriage, 100% Democrats would be against gay marriage in the 1990s.
I mean, if you only think in terms of social policy, then I mean that's probably true. I mean, in the 90s, I'm pretty sure that the vast majority of Democrats weren't in favor of gay marriage. So in terms of social policy, it's probably just objectively correct. But I mean, if you look outside of that, I mean, there's
what would something that moved right, I guess, be?
I mean, in terms of economic policy, I don't think that would be the case.
What's moved right in economics?
Oh God. Let me think first.
I can't think of anything. The Democrats didn't suddenly decide that they didn't like, universal health care. As a matter of fact, in the 90s, the Democrats would have considered Obamacare to be a far left position, and now it's baseline, right?
I don't know. I mean, Obamacare was basically it was also a policy proposal by Republicans. Universal healthcare used to be a lot more bipartisan than it is now. That's part of the problem comparing stuff is that these things sort of shift over time. Like it used to be the case that gay marriage was kind of unthinkable for either party. It was proposed. Obviously, it's a left-wing social position, and now it's sort of the default for everyone. But it used to be the case that universal healthcare was perfectly conceivable by either party.
Yeah,
Um,
like in sort of the 60s.
yeah,
I'll
I
grant you
mean,
that. Yeah.
yeah, and even a move towards single payer would have been conceivable from a Republican point of view in like the '90s. But nowadays, I mean, I don't even think a single payer system is really conceivable from Democrats. So, um, yeah, I mean, it's kind of difficult to know. Um, I don't know. I would need to think about it. In general, I really don't think so. That sounds pretty wrong, but it's also 1 a.m. and I can't think right now. So I
Yeah,
don't have my best arguments
I have
equipped.
to finish this too. I'm getting really tired.
Yeah.
Nirvan Maker talks about Republicans being or not being permanently displaced, ignores the fact that Republicans will have to move more left. Oh, I already read this one. I think we're done with
Yeah.
the super chats.
Oh, okay.
Okay, guys. Oh no, another one. Okay, guys, no more super chats, okay? Um, Gartham says, "Hey Doomer, glad to see you talking with Dave. You guys held a great conversation. Also, fuck Sitch." For
Based.
$5 USA. Yeah, I was a little bit angry at Adam and Sitch because I believe that they misrepresented my opinions on one of their live streams, but I think we buried the hatchet on that. Sitch asked me a bunch of questions about my positions to clarify, and I made a video around that. I don't think Adam and Sitch really care, but if you're curious about my opinions on the failures or non-failures of civil rights, it's pretty much in that video.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't watch that initial debate. I think I actually made a super chat at the
He did
beginning
actually,
saying
yeah.
that you're better than Sitch, and then I left.
Well, we talked about a lot of the same things we talked about here, right?
Yeah.
And my opinion that I was advancing was that there's been a marked sort of decline in human well-being since the 70s or since the late 60s, and that I think that we've been preoccupied with these concepts of civil rights, and we haven't been addressing the human issues. And we're kind of in a bind where we can't address these things well because of this preoccupation.
Yeah. Well, I can see how that would be a difficult conversation because it's sort of the same here. Your priorities are not in line with probably minor Sitches, so it's kind of hard to. You have to ask a lot of questions to figure out what you mean, and it's not being a dick. It's just like, I've talked to a lot of people about politics. I've never, I don't talk to very many people where optimizing birth rights is a primary concern. It's a different frame of thought to consider.
Oh, it's not optimizing. I'm not trying to slam them up. I'm just trying to keep them above a threshold.
Yeah.
Like, and the reason why I'm keeping them above the threshold is because it's way harder to bring them up than to bring them down. And and having your birth rates in this position where they're crashing forces you to do a bunch of really, really short-sighted things, I believe. And I don't see that. I don't know. I see that technology at this point seems to be causing as many problems as it's solving. And as Stardust said on our stream, we've gone to a point where technology is basically just being introduced to solve the problems that technology created. Like, I can't get a date, right? Like, to get an online dating app, right? But if you were a guy who was reasonably attractive and had reasonably good professional prospects in the 90s, you actually wouldn't have that hard of a time getting a date.
Yeah. I mean, that's probably still true.
So this is now we're so like this is so funny because the last conversation I had with Stardust, and I was saying, like, you probably have an okay chance of being able to marry somebody. And Stardust was of the opinion that if you were a below average looking guy with poor earning prospects, you'd be lucky if you even got a one night stand or a hookup. And so it's so funny because it seems like you're way more optimistic than I am. He's way more pessimistic, and I'm kind of in the middle somewhere.
I mean, I think that the dating market is probably mostly fine if you are both attractive and rich as a man. Or not rich, but let's say attractive and middle class. I think you're probably doing okay. But like, particularly if you don't have money and you're unattractive, it's, you know, hope you can tell a joke, dog. You know, you got to have something. This is going to be, it's a tough road. I mean, it's the whole like the graph thing, right? Like 80% of women say that like the average man is, you know, like a 3 or whatever. I don't remember exactly what the stat was, but
Yeah, I mean that's not an optimistic graph, right? That's
yeah. I mean, it's a problem, right?
so
Women have a
it
selection
didn't used to
pressure.
be that brutal, right? Like, I mean, it didn't used to be that brutal. I remember it not being that brutal.
Oh yeah, I mean, the online environment contributes to it a lot.
Well, on that we're agreed, and I am incredibly tired too. And so I'm going to let you guys let you go. Doomer, thank you so much for joining me. I think it was a great conversation, despite the fact that our priors are so far apart. But have
Yeah,
a
I
wonderful
mean,
night, okay?
yeah. Sorry for being a dirty commie. Right.
Oh,
Well,
hey,
well,
man, I'm a reactionary, so you know it's all par for the course. We're both elitist schools of thought, in my opinion.
yeah. Right. I'll talk to
All
you
right,
later.
guys, everyone have a wonderful, blessed night. I'll catch you later.